Chapter 276. Silen and Huimao stayed in the forest for 3 days, and they had a general understanding of the rules of survival in the forest. Bio-soldiers and dire beasts divided the world, but there were different classifications among them. There were a few levels of bio-soldiers. The ones that Silen had encountered before were all beginner-level bio-soldiers. The higher the level of the bio-soldier, the darker the color of their skin. During the past 3 days, Silen had encountered a high-level bio-soldier. His skin color was very dark, and he could clearly sense that his skin was incredibly tough. The same arrow could completely sink into a beginner-level bio-soldier, but it could only break a layer of skin on a high-level bio-soldier. It couldn't do any real damage. So, after Silen encountered the high-level bio-soldier, he began to think of ways to modify the crossbow. As for food, Silen ate some fruits and plants. Just like Huimao, he ate raw meat. Silen had experienced this a long time ago, and he didn't have any psychological or physical resistance to it. The slightest heat could attract a lot of insects and beasts. Those things were like moths, and when they saw a source of heat, they would rush toward it. It was true that many of the machines in the forest had hidden dangers. So, during the 3 days that Silen had been here, he hadn't seen any signs of gun attacks. He believed that the people who came here like him didn't use guns often either. Silen, a few beginner-level bio-soldiers are coming, Huimao, who was lying on a tree, contacted Silen. Silen looked over and saw a few brown shadows in the distance, but they weren't coming this way. Silen was still quietly waiting. But the crossbow was ready, and the arrowhead was coated with some poison. Silen had obtained the poison from some plants in the forest. Silen had been experimenting for the past 3 days. He tested the poisons he obtained from the plants on the bio-soldiers and some dire beasts, but most of the poisons that were fatal to ordinary people didn't have much of an effect on these creatures. In the end, only 2 poisons had any effect on them. These 2 types of toxins were the same as the other types of toxins. They belonged to the category of neurotoxins, but the difference was that these 2 types of toxins had different methods of action. In reality, most of the poisons Silen had tried were not very effective against the wild beasts. The main reason was that most of the plants in the forest contained toxins, and the wild beasts would sometimes eat the fruits of these plants. As a result, they gradually developed a resistance to the toxins. As for the bio-soldiers, they were the same. However, it was not that they had developed resistance, but that it was a matter of genetics. The 2 poisons that were effective could inhibit their polysynaptic reflex arcs, interfere with neuromuscular conduction, and cause their muscles to relax. The bio-soldiers had very developed muscles, and their explosive power was very strong. Although this kind of poison could not directly make the bio-soldiers lose their ability to fight, it could serve as a buffer and buy more time for Silen to deal with it. Suddenly, Huimao's ears twitched. A large number of bio-soldiers are coming. There are even high-level ones among them. Silen frowned. Why had so many bio-soldiers suddenly appeared? These bio-soldiers did not have group consciousness like normal people. Most of the time, they were more scattered, and sometimes they would even kill each other. But what was going on now? Silen could also hear the commotion, and they were moving very quickly, as if they were chasing something. The steps of the bio-soldiers were relatively heavy to begin with, and this was especially obvious when they ran. If one was like this, then a dozen or so of them gathered together, the commotion would be very loud. Moreover, there were also other wandering bio-soldiers joining them, so the group grew larger and larger, and the commotion became louder and louder. The bio-soldiers that Silen saw had clearly heard the commotion, and they were looking for the source of the commotion. Finally, Silen found the culprit who had caused this commotion. In front of nearly 20 bio-soldiers, there was a person who looked rather thin and weak, running as fast as he could. He was moving very quickly, or else he would have been caught by the bio-soldiers. And in front of the group of nearly 20 bio-soldiers, there were 2 bio-soldiers whose skin color was clearly much darker. They were high-level bio-soldiers. Silen was puzzled. How did this person get involved with so many bio-soldiers? And he had provoked more than one high-level bio-soldier. The person running in front of the group of bio-soldiers seemed to be in a very bad shape, but he seemed to be in good spirits. Silen could not help but admire this. Although he did not know how long he had been running, it seemed like he could continue for a long time. Because of this group of bio-soldiers, there was no need to worry about the dire beasts. When the dire beasts saw the large group of bio-soldiers, they would obediently avoid them. The person and the bio-soldiers were getting closer and closer, but according to their original route, they would miss the place where Silen was hiding. At the closest, they were about 20 meters away. Silen did not choose to run away. Based on his understanding of the bio-soldiers over the past few days, the bio-soldiers would not be able to discover him. If he left rashly and caused some commotion, he would definitely be implicated. Silen did not want to provoke so many bio-soldiers, not to mention that there were 2 high-level bio-soldiers among them. Just as Silen was wondering what this person had done to the bio-soldiers to trigger such a large group of people to chase after him, the group of people was less than 50 meters away from Silen. Suddenly, the person made a sharp turn and ran directly towards Silen. Silen's eyelid twitched, and he had a bad feeling. The person had clearly noticed Silen as he ran. Trying to drag me down with him. Silen quickly packed up his things and gestured to Hui Mao to get ready to run. Now was not the time to deal with that person. The person ran like the wind, and when he got close to Silen, he looked at Silen with a look of exasperation and said in a low voice, "Do you want to die? Hurry up and run." Silen, if it were not for the fact that this person's eyes did not contain any malice, and instead were clearly filled with worry, Silen would definitely have strangled this guy to death. If it weren't for this bastard, would they have been discovered by those bio-soldiers? Hurry up, follow me." Before the person could finish, he realized that Silen was running a bit faster than him. "Don't run into the dense forest," the person yelled anxiously. Silen curled his lips. "Do you think I don't know?" Thus, the number of people chasing after the bio-soldiers increased from 1 to 2. Silen had already memorized the terrain of this place, and Silen had even set up traps in a few places, just in case. However, he had only set up those traps for a day, and this, what if, had come. Silen ran in front, and the person saw that Silen was not running in the direction of the dense forest, so he followed. When they reached the side of a hill, Silen ran in an arc, and then made a small turn. The person following Silen also ran in the same direction as Silen. As the person ran, there were banging sounds coming from behind. The person did not look back, but Silen did not stop, so he did not stop either. With the delay from the traps, Silen left the bio-soldiers further and further behind. Finally, after confirming that he had completely shaken off the bio-soldiers, Silen stopped in a small hidden cave. This cave was found by Silen on the first day. At night, Silen and Hui Mao rested here. The stone around the cave was very hard. As long as the main entrance was blocked, the dire beasts would not be able to enter easily. To be on the safe side, Silen set up a lot of camouflage around the cave, and he also used several kinds of tree branches to cover up his smell. He also cut out 2 exits in the cave, which could only accommodate 1 person at a time. Even if the large dire beasts found these 2 exits, they would not be able to enter. As for the bio-soldiers, their muscles were so developed that they were directly enlarged, so it was difficult for them to enter. The person followed Silen here, and as soon as he arrived, he rolled on the hay. "Tired. I'm so tired." Silen originally planned to use the knife to interrogate the person, but it seemed that the person did not feel Silen's hostility. He just rolled on the hay that Silen had used as a temporary bed, and then fell asleep. Looking at the person, Silen had no idea what he was thinking. Even when Silen placed the knife next to the person's neck artery, the person did not react. Heartbeat, blood flow, pulse, everything indicated that if this person was not an experienced sly fox who was skilled in psychological tactics, then he was an idiot. Silen believed that it was the latter. Hui Mao walked around the person and sniffed. Other than the smell of some plants, there is no other smell. Besides, there is nothing on him except for a dagger. He also knows how to use the smell of plants to cover up his smell. But what kind of person is this guy? Logically speaking, the people who were recommended for the test should not be at this level. Scylla took the dagger that the person was carrying. The quality of the dagger was very good. It was sharp, light, and resistant to corrosion. It was very suitable for this person. Should I kick him out? Hui Mao asked. Ignore him for now. Let's take a break. Scylla did not feel any malice from this person. Scylla had always believed in his intuition, but this person gave Scylla a feeling of helplessness. There were always some people who thought that they had done a good deed, but they did not know that the effect was the opposite. This person looked very simple and did not have many thoughts. Like Hui Mao, he did not know how to lie. Moreover, in addition to running fast, his physical strength was not good. In terms of combat power, it was estimated that he was trash. And what puzzled Scylla was that from the person's clothes, he had at least stayed in the forest for more than 10 days. In other words, he came earlier than Scylla. There were many scratches on his clothes. Some were from plants, and some were from animals, but this person was still alive. The dark circles under his eyes were very heavy. It was likely that he had not slept well. That was why he could sleep so soundly after running in a sorry state. Finally, after sleeping for 2 hours, the man finally woke up. He was still a little groggy after waking up. He stared at Scylla and Hui Mao for a moment before letting out an "ah." It looked like he remembered who he was. Who are you? Scylla asked. The person combed through his messy hair before answering Scylla. My name is Neo. Neo was very angry when he saw that Scylla was holding his dagger. I saved you, but you stole my dagger. If you hadn't rushed over, those bio-soldiers wouldn't have noticed me at all. Scylla had no intention of returning the dagger to Neo. Seeing that Scylla's tone was serious and his expression did not look like he was lying, Neo's eyebrows knitted together. Is that so? But at that time, I really wanted to warn you, so I ran over. Scylla put on a doubtful expression. You don't believe me? Look at my face and you will find the answer. Dark circles under your eyes? No, it's sincerity. Neo said seriously. Your sincerity is so deep that all I can see is the shallow dark circles under your eyes. That's your problem. Let me tell you, the truth can often be seen on our faces. You can see a lot from a single expression, a single look in our eyes, and even the contraction of our pupils. Neo began his explanation and gave an example to prove it. Take you for example. You look a little angry right now, and you even seem to be a little violent. But what I don't understand is why you're angry. Is it because of a misunderstanding? Also, let me give you a reminder. According to our investigations, workplace violence is closely related to domestic violence. This isn't a workplace, Scylla interrupted him. To me, this is. Why did you follow me here? Scylla asked. In fact, I think that following you will give me a better guarantee of safety. Based on the situation and your reaction at the time, I compared the safety probability of following you and running away on my own. The safety probability of following you is 26% higher than running away on my own. You're very conceited, Scylla said. No, it's confidence. I've done a test, and I'm 1792 times more intelligent than the Empire's average. What test? The frequency at which your ears twitch. Scylla looked at Neo's ears, which had been twitching ever since he woke up. No, it's an IQ test. Celine. Is the reference for an IQ test a pig? Alright, Mr. Neo with high IQ, may I ask why you were chased by those bio-soldiers? Scylla asked. Sigh, it's a long story. Neo looked very depressed when he said this. You know, in this almost primitive environment, money is just a worldly possession. It's easy for knowledge to lag behind and need to be updated frequently. Only the food you eat belongs to you. You mean it's for food? Yes, I was looking for a kind of fruit. Unfortunately, I was discovered by those bio-soldiers with rock-like IQs. Then, Mr. Neo with high IQ, may I ask if you're willing to tell me about the fruit you were looking for, and how you were chased by those rock-like bio-soldiers? Of course, Neo answered honestly without any awkwardness. Chapter 277. Neo wasn't lying when he said that this was a workplace for him. Neo was a black viper. In his own words, he was born and raised in Black Viper. He had been in Black Viper for as long as he could remember, but he didn't know what kind of organization Black Viper was and how many important figures of the Empire were in it. The only thing he cared about was his own research. Neo didn't have a fixed research project. He acted completely on his own interest. Whenever he was interested in a certain problem, he would dive into it wholeheartedly. For example, this time, he wanted to find a drug that could deal with cyborgs. After trying many different drugs, Neo finally set his sights on a certain plant. This plant was a type of mutated plant that couldn't be found on many planets. There were no records of it either. Neo found it by chance. In fact, Neo had used both plant toxins to deal with the cyborgs before, but they didn't fit his ideal target. The plant he was looking for bore fruit all year round, and its fruits were a mix of red, black, and yellow. It was incredibly colorful, and it gave off an intoxicating sweet scent that attracted the attention of nearby birds and beasts. When the birds and beasts ate the fruit, they would immediately go limp and die quickly. The dead animals would become fertilizer for the plant. The plant's roots would secrete some special substances that changed the composition of the soil and allowed microorganisms to live in the surroundings. The existence of these microorganisms would make the dead animals rot faster. It was a mutually beneficial relationship. For other animals, it was a double kill. I named this plant tricolored bean. However, tricolored beans are very difficult to find. I've only found 2 of them so far. One of them has been used up, and the other one was discovered by the bioweapons before I could pluck it. Neo was a little depressed when he mentioned this. He was so close. His hand was less than 10 centimeters away from the tricolored bean at the time. What a pity. Since he attributed the whole thing to a low probability event, Neo didn't feel that he had made a mistake. As for the so-called low probability event, it was actually a pile of bird poop that fell from the sky at a critical moment. It hit the leaves around Neo and attracted the attention of the bioweapons nearby. That was why there were no absolutes in this world. Even if Neo had planned everything out perfectly, he wouldn't have expected a pile of bird shit to fall on him at a critical moment. For the bio-soldiers whose vision and hearing were more developed, the "pa" sound was already loud enough. Silen thinks for a moment. The fruit Neo mentioned contained poison that was similar to the 2 he had, but it was obvious that the tricolored bean was much more potent. Where is the fruit you were talking about? Silen asked. If he could get his hands on the tricolored beans, he would be able to easily deal with a squad of bio-soldiers. Neo thought for a moment before replying, "It's a bit far. I ran for 13 hours before I met you. In that case, if they walked on foot, they might not be able to reach the other side in half a day." Silen looked at the sky. It was almost nighttime, and it was not advisable to move around at night. The temperature outside was relatively low at night, and when the ambient temperature was low, the human body's heat source would be more obvious. For the beasts, this was like a red-hot target swaying around. Silen and Huimao could adjust their body temperatures, but Neo couldn't. Growl, Neo rubbed his stomach and said, "My poor stomach is starting to complain. Do you have any food?" Silen took out a fruit from a corner and tossed it to Neo. "Eat it first." "Oh, this is disgusting." Neo looked at the fruit in his hand and said disdainfully. He hated sweet food. "You're going to starve if you don't eat it." "Fine, replenishing energy is the most important thing. In fact, this fruit is very nutritious and contains a lot of sugar." Neo seemed to be saying this to himself so that he could better accept the fruit in front of him. Neo's face contorted as he took small bites of the fruit like it was poison. He would take a bite to calm himself down before continuing. Scylla put a hand to his forehead. Why is there someone like this here? Are black vipers only freaks other than robots? Not long after. Aya! Neo suddenly cried out. What's wrong? Scylla and Huimao turned to look at him. Neo rolled around on a pile of hay while clutching his stomach. Then, he said with difficulty, I don't feel good. My heart rate is abnormal, my stomach hurts, and I have a strong urge to defecate. In other words, he had diarrhea. Scylla covered his face with his hands. I'd be a fool to believe you. Therefore, to prevent Neo from polluting the cave by defecating, Scylla quickly dragged him to a relatively safe place further away from the cave. 15 minutes later. Scylla dragged the exhausted Neo back into the cave after he had solved his problem. Based on the thinness, shape, color, and smell of the excrement, I eliminated parasites, indigestion, bile duct obstruction, intestinal infection, and other causes. There is a 42% chance that the excrement was caused by a disrupted digestive system. In other words, the culprit is that fruit of yours. Scylla. He really wanted to kick this guy out of the cave. Before the sky turned dark, Scylla went to look for some nuts so that he could smoothly carry out his plan the next day. While searching for nuts, Scylla and Huimao both solved their own food problems. Scylla ate a small wild beast raw. He wasn't going to bring this raw food back to the cave for that idiot with a weak stomach. That would be asking for trouble. That being said, Neo knew this area very well. Moreover, he had a foothold somewhere in the area. Black Viper's footholds were all very safe, and they were well fortified enough to keep out the wild beasts and bio-soldiers. Moreover, Scylla was hoping to obtain some equipment from Neo. If it wasn't for that, Scylla would have knocked that guy out a long time ago and left him there. This planet's magnetic field was a little strange, and Black Viper had covered this area with an interference field that increased the instability of subspace items. Therefore, even though the Gen family's identity ring was a little special, Scylla didn't use it as much as possible. He always carried his crossbow and gun with him. He didn't store his food in the ring either. After all, Neo's ability to adapt to nuts was pretty good. After eating the nuts Scylla brought back, his stamina and mental state were much better than before. He no longer spouted infuriating words in a half-dead tone like he had just had diarrhea. Night had fallen. Scylla blocked the cave entrance, camouflaged the cave entrance, and laid down to rest. He looked out from the small crack in the cave. His surroundings were pitch black, and the sky was bright with starlight. However, the land under the starlight was filled with murderous intent. Pairs of bloodthirsty eyes were waiting for prey to appear in the darkness. After resting during the day, the nocturnal animals were now full of energy. They bared their fangs and claws and fought in the dark. He could hear heavy footsteps and strange beast roars from time to time. Scylla withdrew his gaze. Using the faint starlight that shone through the cave ceiling, Scylla saw Neo sleeping on a pile of grass and Huimao curled up in a circle. The two had one thing in common, and that was that their ears were moving. Neo said that his ears could detect danger, but the danger he was referring to was limited to strangers, wild beasts, bio-soldiers and so on. Back when Scylla had pressed a knife against his neck while he was asleep, the guy didn't react at all. It was probably because he had categorized Scylla as someone he knew, and he deemed Scylla to be harmless. As for how he thought that, Scylla didn't know. The next day, Neo was full of energy after a good night's sleep. He actually started doing aerobics in the cave. Save your stamina. I won't help you if you get chased by bio-soldiers or wild beasts again, Scylla said. Don't worry, I understand. Scylla looked at him suspiciously. He didn't know if this guy meant the same thing when he said he understood. They cleaned up the cave and concealed themselves well. Although they didn't know if they would come back after circling around, they absolutely had to keep this place a secret. They couldn't let others discover it and occupy it. Neo might be a bit of an idiot sometimes, but he was a pretty experienced man when it came to surviving in this place. Both Scylla and Neo avoided the bio-soldiers and wild beasts on their way to the place Neo told them about. However, Scylla suddenly saw 3 dead bio-soldiers when they passed through a certain area. These 3 bio-soldiers hadn't been dead for long, so when Scylla discovered them, there were only a few small beasts chewing on their prey. When they saw Scylla and Neo, the small beasts let out a few threatening roars and scattered. They probably knew that the people in front of them weren't to be trifled with. The 3 bio-soldiers had been shot in the head, and all of them had been shot in the same place. There was a bullet hole between their eyebrows. However, it was obvious that this bullet hole wasn't the direct cause of death. There were more bullet holes in other places, and they were visible from the back of the bio-soldiers' bodies. These bullet holes should be the real cause of their death. After they died, they were dissected. The person who dissected them was very skillful. He must have been an experienced veteran. Huali. Neo said. Who are you talking about? Scylla looked at Neo. Judging from the situation, there's a 68% chance that Huali is the culprit. However, she normally doesn't kill bio-soldiers herself. She prefers to analyze the cause of death more than anything else. She probably dissected these 3 bio-soldiers after they were killed by someone, Neo said. Is this Huali of Black Viper too? Of course. We grew up together, but I didn't know that she was here. I wasn't with her when I arrived. Neo seemed to be used to this situation by now. Huali's dissection skills are top-notch. She can dissect a person in less than a minute with a tiny scalpel. Not only that, she can dissect every muscle and meridian in one piece. While Neo was talking about the strange woman who had a fetish for dissecting people, a strange thought suddenly rose in Scylla's mind. Could Black Viper really have an endless supply of freaks other than the robots? Let's get out of here. A large scavenging beast is coming our way very soon. Scylla grabbed Neo, who was still observing the bioweapons meridians. Today's operation was relatively smooth. They didn't run into a lot of bioweapons or beasts, at least not along the path Neo pointed out. This made Scylla suspect that someone had taken care of part of the problem. That was why they were able to move so easily. Also, who was the culprit who killed the 3 bio-soldiers? Did they work for Black Viper, or were they sent here to be tested like Scylla and White Knight? Half a day later, Scylla finally arrived at the place where Neo said the tricolored bean was growing. The tricolor bean was a little different from what Scylla had imagined. There was only one tricolor bean, and it wasn't tall at all. It was about the same height as the shrubs not far away from him, but there was a circular empty space with a radius of around 10 meters around the plant. There was no grass or other small plants in the area, only this one tricolor bean. Scylla also noticed that the ground around the plant was soft and loose. It looked like a layer of fine sand, but this fine sand was a little sticky and moist. These were the microorganisms that lived in a symbiotic relationship with the tricolored bean. They formed a colony of bacteria that squeezed together to form this scene. Scylla was about to test the microorganisms with his finger when Neo slapped his hand away in shock. Are you looking to die? These microorganisms are poisonous. Scylla thought, of course I know they're poisonous. But because of his unique constitution, Scylla wasn't afraid of them at all. Seeing that Neo was about to preach and analyze again, Scylla straightened the colorful tricolored bean and said, let's get down to business. Otherwise, we won't have a chance to deal with the bio-soldiers and the wild beasts. After weighing the pros and cons, Neo decisively gave up on preaching and went to deal with the tricolored bean. Hui Mao was lying on a tree branch as a lookout. A wild beast passed by in the distance, but it wouldn't pass by here. This place was relatively safe. Neo took out a pair of gloves from the inside pocket of his tattered clothes, then took out a plastic bag and put the tricolored beans inside. There were a total of 12 tricolored beans, and Neo put them away like they were treasures. While Neo was dealing with the tricolored beans, Silen used his finger to touch the bacterial colony on the ground and the tricolored bean plant when Neo wasn't paying attention. The moment his finger touched the plant, Silen learned a lot of information about the plant and the bacterial colony on the ground. The poison contained inside the plant was far more potent than the 2 poisons Silen had obtained earlier. Most of the toxins that worked against the bio-soldiers were concentrated inside the fruit, so the poison extracted from the fruit should be very effective against the bio-soldiers. According to the plan, the duo would go to Neo's temporary workplace after finding the tricolored beans. Half a day later, Silen finally arrived at Neo's place. This place looked like a tree growing on a cliff. A tree? Yes. However, this tree was only a door. Neo opened a certain part of the tree and checked his identity. The tree's trunk opened up to form a 1.8-meter-tall door. Someone was here, Neo said with a frown. After entering the tree, the door closed again. However, sunlight could still shine in from the outside. It was just that the people outside couldn't see what was inside. There was also an emergency light source here, and the walls were made of special materials. No one outside could detect the heat signature of this place, so it was possible to use thermal weapons or electrical equipment here. The elevator inside the tree sent Silen, Huimao, and Neo underground. To be more precise, this was the inside of the cliff. Black Viper's people had built a workshop inside the cliff. While they were inside the elevator, Neo brought up the image and displayed the people who had entered during the time Neo was gone. There was a man and a woman. The man looked about the same age as Silen. His skin was dark, and his hair was tied into a ponytail. He was muscular and looked like a fierce beast. However, the image showed that he wasn't in good condition. He swayed uncontrollably when he stood up. The woman looked like she was about 13 or 14 years old. She was pretty and cute, but the image showed that she was crying all the time. She was crying so much that she was hiccuping. Her crying seemed to annoy the man. He yelled at her several times, but she didn't stop crying. Your friend? Silen pointed at the woman and asked Neo. You can say that. What a pain in the ass. Wasn't she a fast runner? How did she get caught? Her intelligence is pitiful. Silen thought that it was better not to dwell on the issue of intelligence. Neo jumped behind Silen when the elevator was about to reach their destination. According to his calculations, hiding behind Silen was 13 times safer than hiding behind Silen. Silen took out his dagger and readied his gun. He didn't know why the other party was here, so it was better to be careful. The elevator door opened, and a hall appeared in front of them. There was no one inside the hall, but there was an empty cup inside. Silen also smelled an unfamiliar scent. Silen nudged Neo and looked at a tightly shut room at the back of the hall. Over there. Neo said soundlessly. Silen nodded. Now that he knew that the stranger was inside the room, Neo wasn't afraid at all. This was his territory after all. He set the settings on the light screen on the wall and locked the door. Neo entered his lab and carefully put away the tricolored beans. Then, he jumped out and rolled around on the sofa in the hall. I'm finally back. Ahahaha. Silen. Did you forget that there's someone in the room, and the hostage is someone you know? Neo happily introduced the place to Silen with obvious pride. He even took out some of the food he made. Although Silen didn't think the food tasted good, both Neo and Huimao ate it with relish. Maybe it was because the people in the living room were too reckless, but the person hiding in the room finally couldn't hold back anymore. There were communication devices installed in the living room and the room. While Silen and the other two were eating, the communication device rang, and a broken, hiccuping voice said, Neo, there's a bad guy, Even Silen was tired of hearing the person burping 3 times with every sentence. Neo was obviously not a compassionate person. He wiped his mouth and pulled up the surveillance footage of the room. When he saw the man pointing a gun at the little girl who was crying and burping non-stop, he said, Who told you to bring him in? Ugh, he said he'd kill me if I didn't bring him in. Ugh, Neo stared at the person on the screen. Nausea, elevated body temperature, irregular heart rate, muscle spasms, and retinal bleeding. Are you poisoned? Actually, I suggest that if you want to eat those wild beasts, it's best to roast them before eating them, and they have to be well done too. Most of the wild beasts living here contain toxins in their bodies, and high temperature will break them down. This is common sense. Common sense my ass. Scylla and everyone else in the room had the same thought at the same time. I really want to strangle this bastard who doesn't even know how to speak. Of course, you don't have to worry about heat and energy when you live here, but it's very easy to get yourself killed outside. It was obvious that the person inside the room knew that he was poisoned, but he couldn't find any medicine at all. He couldn't enter the rooms where the medicine was stored or Neo's lab, so this bedroom was the only place he could enter. Although this person appeared to be a bit fierce, he did not really have the intention to kill the little girl. If he really had evil intentions, would he give the little girl a pillow so that she could comfortably lean on it and not have a backache? It looked like the man was annoyed by the little girl's incessant crying, and he was even feeling a little guilty. Logically speaking, the man wouldn't be so obvious under normal circumstances, but he wasn't in a good state right now. Even though he tried his best to control his emotions, a few of his thoughts were still exposed. When Scylla saw that the man didn't have any killing intent and only wanted to use the little girl to threaten Neo, he said, "You're here to take the test too, aren't you? Come out, we're all the same. You don't want to hurt the little girl, and if you don't get treatment soon, you'll die in half an hour at most." "It's 27 minutes and 46 seconds, Neo corrected him. Scylla shot him a sideways glance. Neo curled his lips. He wasn't the slightest bit self-conscious about his stubbornness. In the end, the man agreed to Scylla's suggestion. He moved the gun away from the girl and tossed it to the side. His breathing was starting to become labored, his brain was running out of blood, his vision was starting to blur, and his muscles were twitching so much that he could only lean against the wall like the little girl. Just pointing the gun at the girl took a lot of energy out of him. Scylla motioned for Neo to remove the lock on the room. After removing the lock on the room, Neo carefully opened the door and hid to the side the moment he opened it. He didn't want to accidentally injure himself during the fight. The man didn't look like he was in a good condition, but Neo had a feeling that he still had the strength to fight for his life. After opening the door, the little girl was still sitting there crying. She kept burping and burping. Seeing that there wasn't any fighting going on outside, Neo poked his head out and said to the girl, "Asho, come here quickly." "Ugh, my legs, ugh, my legs are numb, ugh." "Neo." Scylla glanced at the unconscious man on the ground and yelled at Neo, "Give me the medicine." Neo disappeared for a while. When he reappeared, he was already tossing the medicine at Chin Lai. "I don't know if it's effective. After all, I don't know what kind of vicious beast meat he ate to be poisoned. However, this medicine has a wide range of effects. Let's give it a try. If it doesn't work, we'll just toss him out." Scylla and the person on the ground. Scylla let out a sigh. "You're on your own now." Scylla opened the bottle of medicine and revealed the syringe inside. He injected the medicine into the man. The man didn't resist or refuse, but Scylla knew that if Scylla had tried to kill him just now, the man would have fought with his life on the line. It was a kind of conditioned reflex. If Scylla's guess was correct, this man was from the military. After the medicine was injected, the man closed his eyes and his body temperature was still rising. Outside the door, Neo had already started recording the man's data and testing the medicine's effects from time to time. Neo looked at the display on the device in his hand. It's working. Although his body temperature is still a bit high, his heart rate is gradually stabilizing, and his physiological indicators are recovering quickly. Half an hour later. The little girl named Asho was drinking fruit juice on the living room sofa with red and swollen eyes. Although she had stopped crying, the hiccups didn't stop. She would hiccup every once in a while, but they were gradually calming down. The man who had recovered was wolfing down the food on his plate. There was an agreement next to his hand. It was the agreement Neo had asked him to sign. The man's name was Gu Xen. He didn't know if he was one of the people Sillin had told him to take the test. He had returned to his dorm room to rest after completing his mission, but when he opened his eyes again, he found himself in this damned place. He had nothing on him except a gun and a dagger. Even now, Gu Xen was still clueless about what had happened. Neo had asked Gu Xen to help him search for some research plants under the guise of his savior, and Gu Xen had agreed. He was relatively safe here anyway, so he might as well help this psychopath find some plants before he figured out what had happened. Sillin drew a map of the surroundings and pointed at a place they had passed before. He asked Gu Xen, "You killed these 3 beginner bio-soldiers, didn't you?" Gu Xen nodded. "Yes, I did. You killed each of them with 2 shots. One to the head, and the other to their vitals. What I want to ask is, how did you know where their vitals were?" Sillin was very confused about this. Gu Xen clearly didn't use the same method as Sillin. Sillin always killed the beginner bio-soldiers in 1 shot. Gu Xen thought for a moment and decided to tell the truth. "At first, I shot them in the head, but I discovered that it didn't have much of an effect. Only 1 out of 10 of them died immediately after being shot in the head. Later, I noticed that the core of the bio-soldiers' vitals would issue a survival command after being shot in the head. It would allow them to continue moving, and this core is their vitals. So that's how it is." Sillin nodded. "Oh right, what is this place?" Gu Xen asked. Neo had talked too much earlier, and he didn't mention anything he wanted to know when he signed the agreement. Ah Shou was crying and hiccuping, so Gu Xen decided to ask Sillin in the end. "This is Black Viper's territory." After saying this, Sillin left a shocked Gu Xen behind and went to the lab to extract the toxin. Chapter 278. Sillin didn't put much effort into the extraction of the tricolored bean's toxins. He spent most of the time watching from the sidelines. Sillin knew quite a bit about the process of extracting and purifying effective toxins from plants and repairing some of the defects in the molecules. Therefore, according to Sillin's past experience, a job like this involved a lot of analysis and calculation, and it required a higher level of knowledge from the worker. If a person were to complete the entire process alone, it would take more than half a day to complete. However, Neo was already used to it. He completed all the work in just 2 hours, and even perfected the toxins that were specifically targeted at a biohuman's constitution. Sillin couldn't help but admire him for this. Sillin was also able to complete all the work in this short period of time, but this was mainly because of Sillin's own uniqueness. At the very least, up until now, Sillin had never seen anyone who could complete so much work in such a short period of time. Even the affiliated schools were a bit lacking in this regard. In this regard, Neo was like a precise calculating machine. Moreover, he had an extraordinary nature and ability to predict his research targets. The moment he started working on a project, he had already planned out the next step, and even more steps and calculations in his mind. Of course, there were certain aspects of this machine that were not working normally. Neo could be called a genius. Just like Neo's obsessive-compulsive tendency to digitize his daily life, he was also very strict when it came to his experiments. Even the RAS thought that the precision of his data was too harsh. After 2 hours of forgetful work, Neo held a small bottle of orange-yellow liquid in his hand and shouted excitedly, "It's finally out." These toxins were slightly different from the natural toxins extracted from the tricolored bean, but theoretically speaking, these toxins were more effective against bio-soldiers. "Here, use these to fight bio-soldiers. It's best if you do it around here. I can see and record the data from here and test the effects." Neo handed the 3 bottles in his hand to Sillin and said. Sillin was already used to Neo's self-centered way of speaking. Those who didn't know Neo well would misunderstand his commanding tone. This guy didn't seem to know how to be tactful. He was so direct that it made people want to slap him. It just so happened that Gu Xian had pretty much recovered by now, and this was mainly because of Gu Xian's physical constitution. According to Neo, Gu Xian's physical constitution was pretty good. His body had developed a resistance to the poison, and he would be fine the next time he came into contact with the same type of poisonous meat. Aren't you afraid of getting poisoned? Sillin asked Neo. Even if the Black Viper's people had a safe place to stay and heat up their food, they couldn't guarantee that all the food was safe, right? How could a physique like Neo's and Ah Shou's, whose eyes were red from crying and who was still hiccuping non-stop, possibly compare to Gu Xian? Oh, about that. We were vaccinated before we came here, and we were also injected with the compound antiserum. We won't be as bad as you guys. Also, we were given antidotes and some backup drugs. Speaking of which, Ah Shou, what are you doing here instead of staying at your own place? Neo was very displeased with Ah Shou's behavior. Sillin and Gu Xian covered their faces. Ah Shou, who had just stopped crying, was crying and hiccuping again. It was stolen by the bad guys, ugh. Ah Shou's tears started flowing like floodgates. Ah Shou had gone up the mountain to take in some fresh air and have some fun. Who would have thought that a bunch of strangers would enter her place when she returned? They wanted to capture Ah Shou, but Ah Shou slipped away like the wind. Unfortunately for her, she ran into a dangerous person like Gu Xian right after she left the tiger's den. Ah Shou had to have a way to protect herself since she was able to make it here. Just like Neo, she was a fast runner, but Ah Shou was even faster. Ah Shou's physique was special. Her bones were a lot lighter than a normal person's, and her body was thin and delicate. But according to Neo, Shou could run as fast as a tornado, and Gu Xian had confirmed it himself. If he hadn't used some tricks, there was no way he could have caught Ah Shou. Then why didn't you bring him to your place and let them fight each other? Neo said. Gu Xian looked at Neo, and then at the hiccuping and crying Ah Shou. In the end, he still felt that Ah Shou was the better choice. Ah Shou paused for a moment when she heard Neo's words. Then, she cried even harder. You, he said. I'll take him to a safe, place, but, my place is, not safe anymore. Neo said with a look of disdain, I seriously doubt your intelligence. Hui Mao, who was licking his claws next to Ah Shou, flicked his ears and looked at Neo before continuing to lick his claws. Sillin guessed that the bad guys Ah Shou was talking about were people who were brought here to be tested just like him and Gu Xian. However, he didn't know who else was in this place other than the military. Gu Xian admitted that he was from the military, but he kept his mouth shut about which military unit he belonged to. Both he and Sillin kept their backgrounds a secret, and Neo and Ah Shou weren't interested in it either. Therefore, everyone got along fairly well with each other. The name Gu Xian was definitely his real name, but Gu Xian didn't seem to be afraid that someone would investigate this name. Sillin guessed that if someone really did go to the military to investigate this name, they would definitely receive the news that, this person is deceased. The people who were allowed to come here were definitely the special kind of people in the military, and their records had been altered a long time ago. Alright, the two of you should go and try out my research results. Neo urged. Originally, he was planning to shoot through a couple of hidden windows on the cliff, but unfortunately, a flock of flying beasts had been passing through this place recently. For the sake of the 37% chance of being discovered, Neo gave up on that place and ordered Sillin and Gu Xian to stand guard at the top of the tree. Sillin and Gu Xian took the two modified guns Neo gave them and moved to the top of the tree. Each thick branch was just big enough to fit one person, so Sillin and Gu Xian hid here and waited. Hui Mao volunteered to lure the bio-soldiers away. Are braids allowed in the military? Sillin asked Gu Xian. According to military rules, a small braid like this wasn't welcomed by the officers. It wasn't allowed at first, but it became allowed later on. Gu Xian didn't say much, but the moment he mentioned it, Gu Xian immediately recalled something from the past. He had grown used to having braids since he was young, but on his first day in the military, he was ordered to shave his head with a knife, and Gu Xian beat the crap out of that officer. Gu Xian was a troublemaker, and every officer who taught him loved and hated him at the same time. However, he couldn't keep his braids until he entered that special place. "They're here." Silen and Gu Xian waited in the thick branches they had chosen. Holding the guns Neo gave them, they watched the 5 bio-soldiers running in the distance. Hui Mao was running in front of the 5 bio-soldiers while shouting smugly. He was treating this as a game. The distance between the tree and the bio-soldiers was about 3,000 meters, and the wind blew occasionally on this side of the cliff. Therefore, it was a bit difficult. Neo definitely wouldn't be able to hit the bio-soldiers, and he would be able to graze the bio-soldiers' skin without moving. When the bio-soldiers reached the spot Silen had predicted, Silen fired without hesitation. One of the running bio-soldiers was shot in the abdomen. It collapsed limply to the ground and died 2 seconds later. This shot didn't hit a vital spot. It was only 5 centimeters away from where Silen had predicted it would be. However, this was also part of his and Neo's plan. The first shot was to test the effect of a non-vital spot. "Very good, shoot their heads again." Neo's excited voice came from the communicator. They were communicating through the communicator provided by Neo, so they wouldn't be detected by the flying beasts that occasionally flew by. Once again, a flying beast stood on the branch Silen was standing on and pecked at its fur. It didn't notice anything amiss. Gu Xian fired the second shot, and it hit a bio-soldier in the head. The effect was similar to the one Silen had killed. "Alright, the next one is to shoot their vitals," Neo said. Silen's third shot hit a bio-soldier's vitals, and the effect was obvious. The bio-soldier died almost immediately. The bullets used in Neo's gun weren't very powerful. Even if a bio-soldier was shot in the vitals, it wouldn't die immediately without the help of the drugs. It would struggle for 3 to 5 seconds. However, it was a different story after the drugs were combined. Gu Xian raised an eyebrow when he saw Silen's shot, but he didn't say anything. He was surprised that Silen was able to find a bio-soldier's vitals without firing a shot in the head first. "Have you collected all the data?" Silen asked Neo. If he hadn't, then he would shoot their vitals. Shoot another bio-soldier's vitals to confirm it. "Alright." Silen raised his gun and fired again. Another of the 2 remaining bio-soldiers that were running in circles with Hui Mao collapsed. Confirmation complete. "Let's shoot the arm for the last one." Neo's tone was filled with joy. It looked like the effects of the drugs were pretty good. Gu Xian was the one who fired the last shot. He hit the bio-soldier's right arm. The bio-soldier that was shot in the right arm died a few seconds longer than it should have, but the result was still pretty good. With this drug, they would have an extra layer of protection even if they ran into a group of bio-soldiers in the forest. "Are these the only 5? Silen asked. "That's it for now. You guys can come back now." Silen summoned Hui Mao back to his side and returned to the safe zone under the tree. Neo had already gone into his lab to process the data. He ignored them because he had some compressed food in his locker. All he needed to do was decompress it. There was a display in the living room that displayed the situation outside. Silen and the others sat there and started eating after they decompressed the food. They watched the scene outside while they ate. Hui Mao crouched at the side and didn't eat. It had already eaten when it went out to play with the bio-soldiers. While licking its paws, Hui Mao's attention was attracted by Gu Xian's pigtail. It stuck out its butt and stretched its back. Then, it ran to the back of Gu Xian's chair and played with Gu Xian's pigtail with its paw. Gu Xian blocked the cat's paw with the handle of his spoon. The next moment, the cat's paw came to play with his whip. Gu Xian turned to look at Hui Mao and was rendered speechless by the cat's eyes that looked like it was looking at a toy. Suddenly, Shou, who was burping and drinking juice, shuddered. He scratched his arm and said in a soft voice, "It's going to hail." Silen and Gu Xian turned to look at Ah Shou. Sho shrunk his head and looked timidly at Silen and Gu Xian. Then, he burped and said in a small voice, "There will be a hail in an hour." Both Silen and Gu Xian were very puzzled. In fact, Gu Xian didn't even mind that the gray cat was playing with his pigtails with its claws. They didn't sense anything out of the ordinary when they went out to shoot the bio soldiers. The weather was fine, and there were no signs of it happening. It's only been a while, and it's already going to hail. In this kind of weather, based on past experience, there's a 99% chance that Sho's prediction will come true, Neo said after he finished processing the data. Will this place be affected if it hails? Silen asked. No, the buildings here are very reliable. However, a hail usually lasts for more than 5 days. Also, Neo looked at Silen and Gu Xian, the food stored here doesn't include you too, so it'll be very difficult to get out if it hails. Therefore, it's best if you two go out and stock up on food before it starts. Silen and Gu Xian exchanged a glance with each other before swiftly finishing the food on their plates. Then, they put on their equipment. Before they left, Neo handed them a list of plants and food he needed like it was a matter of course. The corner of Silen's eyes twitched. Let's see how it goes. I'll bring you some if we run into it. Of course. Neo nonchalantly went back to his room to sleep. In the past, I would have beat him up for sure, Gu Xian said after he came out. It was true that Neo's tone was very confusing, but he didn't feel like he had offended anyone in the slightest. The same sentence, even if it was a compliment, sounded very sarcastic when it came out of his mouth. Are all the Black Nightmares freaks like this? Gu Xian asked Silen. I don't know, but the two I've encountered are freaks. If the dissecting freak Huali was included, then all 3 of them were freaks. Both Silen and Gu Xian's targets were small beasts. After they processed the meat, they put it into a bag and heated it up when they returned. The duo's speed was very fast, and the recovered Gu Xian displayed his extraordinary strength. Small beasts were almost effortless to him. They ran into 2 large beasts along the way, but the duo swiftly took care of them together. Hui Mao went to look for Imoya's nuts. He had no interest in provoking any more beasts after he was full. Hui Mao's ears twitched while he was packing the nuts. He said to Silen and Gu Xian, "Someone's coming." Silen and Gu Xian swiftly hid themselves. The bag containing the beast meat had the ability to block out smell and camouflage. It was very difficult to be discovered if they used grass and branches to hide themselves. After Silen hid himself, he quietly waited for the person who was approaching from afar. The person was moving very fast. He looked like he was running away from something, and he was holding a bone knife in his hand. It was probably made from the bones of a large beast he had killed. The bone was very hard, and it was a good weapon against normal beasts. Gu Xian frowned when he saw the person's face. Why is it that guy? Seeing Gu Xian's reaction, Silen shot him a look. Do you know him? Gu Xian blinked once in confirmation. Still lying on a tree, Hui Mao looked into the distance. Something was coming from that direction again. A roar broke the silence in the forest. The person who heard the roar cursed in a low voice. He quickened his pace, looking for a place to hide as he ran. Suddenly, his gaze shifted to the place where Silen and Gu Xian were hiding. It was indeed easier to hide there. Gu Xian gave Silen a look, indicating for him to take care of it. Silen agreed. The person who had quickened his pace suddenly stopped when he was close to the place, and the knife in his hand flew towards that direction. Gu Xian, who was already prepared, pushed his knife aside and made a sign language. Seeing this sign language, the person was stunned. Although he was still on guard, since there were people chasing after him, he put down the dispute in front of him and let Gu Xian lead him to hide in the bushes behind a slope. He had smeared some plant liquid on his body, which had the effect of covering up his smell. However, after a long time, the effect had somewhat diminished. Gu Xian sprayed some more liquid on his body. The person did not refuse, but he held the knife in his hand tightly, constantly on guard. As long as Gu Xian made the slightest movement, he would immediately kill him. He was clearly very tired, but when he hid, he adjusted his body's condition to be very suitable for hiding. Not long after, a 5-meter-tall lizard-like thing crawled over. What was different from a lizard was that this fellow had 2 large pairs of pincers in front of it. There were erect spikes on its back all the way to its tail, and its body was covered in thick bony scales. With one look, it was obvious that this ferocious fellow was not easy to deal with. The big fellow stopped in its tracks, and the 2 antennae above its head moved. It was using these sensitive antennae to search for a target. As soon as Sillin saw the antennae above the big fellow's head, he knew that he might not be able to hide from this big fellow. He gave Huimao a look, and Huimao yawned. Just as the big fellow's antennae pointed in their direction and was about to come over, a cat's meow not only attracted the big fellow's attention, but also gave Gu Xian and the other person a fright. Anyone would be startled, and at this kind of tense moment, a strange cat's meow suddenly rang out from above. It would be strange if they didn't jump in fright. Huimao meowed as if demonstrating its strength, then spread its claws and jumped into the distance. Seeing that the big fellow was still hesitating, Huimao turned around and rushed towards the big fellow. Gu Xian's eyes widened, and he looked at Sillin. Was he going to sacrifice his pet? But seeing Sillin's calm expression, Gu Xian and the other person turned their gazes in that direction. Huimao ran over and suddenly sped up. They only saw a gray shadow flash, and then only one of the 2 antennae on the big fellow's head was left. Huimao, who had 1 antenna in its mouth, was still swinging its tail in front of them. Gu Xian and the other person. What a ferocious cat! With 1 antenna in its mouth, Huimao ran into the distance. As expected, the big fellow was angry. It let out a loud roar, and the sound waves shook some of the nuts off the tree. Now it was easier to collect the nuts. Sillin thinks. Once the big fellow was far away, Sillin and Gu Xian ignored the other person, and quickly went to collect the nuts. It's about time, let's go back. Sillin said. They were only 10 minutes away from the hour that Asho said. Sillin didn't know what the hailstorm was like here, but it definitely wouldn't be pleasant. It was better to return to the safe zone before it happened. Gu Xian nodded, and then looked at the other person. Erdi, want to go together? Erdi looked at the person who knew his identity, and the young man who was picking up the nuts not far away. He knew that these 2 people weren't simple, but the current situation wasn't looking good for him. After thinking for a while, Erdi was prepared to refuse. He didn't trust people easily. There's going to be a hailstorm soon. I'm afraid you'll be in trouble if you keep going like this, Gu Xian said before Erdi could refuse. Erdi looked at Gu Xian, trying to discern the truth of his words. Let's go. Sillin told Gu Xian to hurry up and leave. It was up to Erdi whether to follow or not. Before Sillin and Gu Xian could get far away, Erdi still decided to follow them. Huimao arrived at the tree earlier than Sillin and Gu Xian. He was still holding the tentacle in his mouth and playing with it with his claws. Neo was very reluctant to see another stranger. Why do you guys like to pick up baggage so much? Bag. Erdi wanted to kill someone. He had never been called a baggage in his entire life. Looking at the skinny and listless Neo who had just woken up, Erdi felt like he could squash the bastard to death with just 2 fingers. Fortunately, Neo was still sleepy, so he went back to his room after a quick trip to the toilet. Inside the living room, Sho was hugging a glass of juice and curled up in a corner of the sofa. The hiccups that had just stopped were starting again when he saw another stranger with a murderous aura. Sillin pointed Erdi to a room with first aid supplies. Knowing Erdi's personality, he wouldn't trust anyone else to treat his wounds. Gu Xian told Erdi who he was while Erdi was cleaning his wounds. Erdi was a celebrity in a certain circle in the 17th star region. The former leader of one of the top underground forces in the 17th star region, the Blood Orchid, had adopted Erdi as his son. Later, the Blood Orchid had an internal strife due to some external factors. The former leader was assassinated, and Erdi began his path of revenge. In the next 2 years, a number of important gang members were assassinated one after another. Other than that, Erdi's hit list included the planetary government, some important government officials and nobles from other planets. Later on, some people called Erdi the Flower of Misfortune. I heard that he was turned into a sieve one time, but his body was never found. Not long after, he appeared again and successfully assassinated a few important government officials who were attending a Star Region conference. Since then, Erdi has been on the most wanted list of the 17th Star Region. However, this person disappeared after that, and Erdi never showed up again after his revenge. I didn't think I'd see him here. The Flower of Misfortune, Erdi. A grown man like him probably wouldn't like being called a flower. However, the name did make the faces of some people in the 17th Star Region turn pale. Be it the gangs, the government, or the nobles who were once involved in the Blood Orchid struggle, the name was a nightmare to them. Chapter 279. Not long after Scylla and the others returned to Neo's safe zone, the sky started to change color. In less than a minute, the clear sky turned dark, and the humidity around them skyrocketed. Crack, 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 hailstones started crashing into the ground. The descent of the hailstones and the change in the weather caught everyone off guard. If Asho hadn't warned them beforehand, even Scylla would have thought in that direction only when the sky changed color. The dangerous elements in this area were not only the biochemical soldiers, the ferocious beasts of various sizes, and the poisonous plants that grew quietly in certain places. Apart from these, there were also all kinds of threatening bacteria and viruses floating in the air. If an ordinary person who had not received any vaccine stayed here, even if there were no biochemical soldiers or ferocious beasts attacking him, he would not be able to survive because the pathological reactions caused by the bacteria and viruses were enough to kill him. Even people as strong as Scylla and Gu Xian were hard to defend against in this place. Scylla was fine, but Gu Xian and Erdi felt it deeply. If they didn't have a hiding spot like this, Scylla's little cave would have been very difficult to survive. It would have been hard to make friends with people. Everyone was drinking hot milk tea. Other than Neo, who was sleeping in his room, everyone was sitting in the living room and watching the hailstorm outside on the screen. Right now, Erdi was a lot less vigilant, and most of his injuries had healed. Scylla and Gu Xian were like him, they were brothers in the same boat. However, Erdi still couldn't figure out why Gu Xian was able to recognize him. Erdi hadn't seen any normal humans since he arrived on this planet. He did run into a lot of biochemical soldiers and wild beasts, but he knew he wasn't the only one. He had seen some biochemical soldiers and wild beasts before. They were hunted and killed by humans, but he hadn't run into them before. Why were they here? Erdi didn't know either. He had hidden himself for almost 2 years, and as a celebrity on the most wanted list of the 17th Star Region, Erdi had hidden himself well after his revenge. At least, he thought he did. He didn't expect to be tricked that day. He only remembered seeing a few people before he fainted, and when he woke up, he was already here. Unlike Gu Xian, who had a knife and a gun, Erdi didn't have anything with him. He had to kill biochemical soldiers and wild beasts himself. It didn't matter, as long as he could survive. How long will the hail last? Erdi asked. Scylla and Gu Xian didn't answer, instead, they looked at Ah Sho. Ah Sho shuddered and burped. 5 days. 5 days. That's good. I can hold on. Echo let out a sigh of relief. But there will be snow after the hail. Erdi, compared to when Scylla and the others went out to look for food, the temperature outside had dropped by nearly 20 degrees, and it was still dropping. Who knew what kind of days they would have to go through in the future? How long will the snow last? Scylla asked Ah Sho. 6 or 7 days. I'm not sure yet, Sho replied timidly. I won't go out if I can. Looks like I'll have to be frugal and sleep more, Gu Xian said. Scylla and the others were holed up in the safe zone. The temperature inside the safe zone was very warm, a stark contrast to the harsh weather outside. The fist-sized ball of ice smashed into the ground, sending shards of ice flying in all directions. By now, both the bio-soldiers and the dire beasts had found a place to hide. In the face of the power of nature, even the strongest dire beasts had to avoid it. The trees inside the forest were very sturdy. Their thick trunks were strong enough to withstand the impact of the hail. Those that couldn't would grow under the lush branches. It was the only way they could survive the natural disaster. As for the other plants, they were smashed to pieces by the hail. But when the hail passed, they would flourish again. This was the power of life. Everyone spent most of the 5 days resting. Neo was a man who slept a lot. Of course, it was a good thing that he could sleep. Everyone wanted to slap him in the face every time he opened his mouth. Neo was very unhappy that so many burdens had come to his place. That was why he ordered Gu Xian, Erdi, and Ah Shou to take care of some of the chores around the house. In order to save energy, most of the chores were done by humans. Neo didn't ask Silan to do those chores because Silan's "I saved you and helped you find the tricolored beans" was enough to make Neo take back his words. Sometimes, Silan wondered if Neo wasn't afraid that they would gang up on him and take this place for themselves. Or did he never think in that direction at all? The latter was more likely. One day, when the hail had just stopped and snow was starting to take the place of the hail, Neo suddenly let out a loud yell and woke everyone up from their sleep. Erdi, who had just finished washing the dishes, was so angry that his hair was about to explode. "What the fuck are you yelling for?" Erdi said irritably while scratching his messy hair. "Oh," Neo let out another strange sigh. "Oh my god, you motherfucker." Ah Shou glanced at a bracelet-like object on her wrist. One of the metal blocks was flashing. She pressed a button on the flashing metal block, and a small screen popped up. There was an encrypted message made up of characters on it. After reading the message, Shou's crying that had stopped for 5 days started again. Ah Shou and Neo's reactions gave Silan and the others a bad feeling. Oh my god, how could they put that secondary metabolite here? Neo walked out of his room with a dejected expression while grabbing his hair that was sticking up from sleep. "What's going on?" Silan asked Neo. "B-13 was sent to this planet," Neo said dejectedly. "B-13. A glint flashed across Gu Xian's eyes. "If I remember correctly, there used to be an illegal biochemical beast called A-13. B-13 is a secondary derivative of A-13, Neo replied. "Weren't they all destroyed?" Gu Xian remembered that an entire planet had been destroyed, but that was Black Viper's doing. Since they were the ones who did it, it wasn't surprising that they were able to get their hands on A-13. But why would someone from Black Viper be interested in a failed product like that? A-13 was a project that a noble had secretly invested in. When it was discovered and publicized, the Empire took certain measures against it. However, there were too many twists and turns, and too many people were involved. In the end, the matter was left unsettled. But not long after, rumors spread that Black Viper had destroyed the entire planet. A-13 is a complete failure, but B-13 isn't much better. The premature aging phenomenon has been resolved, but there are still a lot of problems. How could they throw such an incomplete product into a place like this? It's blah blah blah. Silan wasn't interested in Neo's subjective comments. He asked, "Why do you say that B-13 is an incomplete product?" "Because they can't control themselves completely. They will lose control of themselves if they become agitated and act like lunatics." "Do you have a video introduction?" "Yes, but not all of them." Neo brought up a couple of still images. Huimao's eyes widened. "Rats?" Apart from the first image that clearly showed a rat, the other images didn't show that it was the same creature as the first one. Unlike the big black rats Silan encountered back at Seven Lights, the biochemical beasts in front of him were mostly white in color. They looked no different from a normal white mouse. It was no wonder that white mice had become a model for biochemical beast experiments nowadays. However, there were only a handful of successful experiments. Why does it look like a hedgehog? Ertie pointed at one of the images and asked. That's one of their forms after they've been agitated. So those things at the back that don't look like rats at all are its other forms? I didn't know you were this smart. Neo looked at Ertie like he was a child waiting to be taught. Ertie clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles cracked. He really wanted to beat the bastard to death. How many of these biochemical beasts are there? Scylla asked. I don't know, but I'm sure there are a lot of them. Neo looked very dejected at the mention of this. He didn't expect to run into these things before he came here. At the time, all he wanted to do was to come here and study them as soon as possible. After he signed the consent form and boarded the spaceplane, it was too late for regrets. Even this place can't hold them. Gu Xen looked around. Black Viper was the one who built this place. It'll be difficult. There's a 27% chance that the rodents will dig through. Then we'll have no choice but to defend it. Gu Xen looked at the white world displayed on the other screen. He couldn't find another suitable place to hide. Then I'll leave it to you. Neo said. What weapons do you have? Scylla looked at Neo. The most important thing right now was to get his hands on a suitable weapon. Otherwise, it would be difficult to deal with the biochemical beasts. Not many. Go take a look yourselves. Neo opened a room. There were some guns and cannons displayed inside. It may not be very effective, but it's better than nothing. Let's make do and set up as soon as possible, Scylla said after scanning the place once. At the same time, an opening suddenly appeared on a stone wall on the other side of the forest. It turned out that this place had a safe zone just like Neo's. However, the safe zone here wasn't very big. In fact, it was much smaller than Neo's. Moreover, the place was completely covered in ice due to the hail and snow. Even the walls were covered in a layer of ice. Opening a window required one to break through the ice to breathe in the outside air. A face appeared at the window. It was none other than Huali, the dissecting freak that Neo mentioned. Huali looked at the flying snow and the distant forest before closing the window with a whoosh. She returned to the house and opened a couple of big boxes. She took out some of the things inside and put them into a rectangular box that she had prepared earlier. There were some gun barrels and other weapons inside. After she was done, Huali set up the password and closed the safe zone completely. After exiting the safe zone, Huali walked to the edge of a cliff and put a finger to her mouth. A whistle sounded. They didn't have to worry about attracting the biochemical soldiers and wild beasts at this place. A while later, a silver figure flew up from the bottom of the cliff. When she saw the silver figure, Huali jumped down and landed right on top of it. It was a giant silver eagle. It would be about 3 meters tall if it stood on the ground. After Huali had settled herself on the eagle's back, she gave an order and the eagle flew away from the mountain. Huali passed through the forest while sitting on the eagle's back. There were very few flying beasts in the sky right now. The whole place was covered in white. The snowflakes were dense, and the cold wind cut their faces like knives. Thankfully, Huali was wearing a breathing mask. Suddenly, a bestial roar resounded in front of them. Then, a couple of flying beasts took to the air and flew towards Huali and the eagle while clamoring. Let's not waste time with them right now. Let's change our route first, Huali said. The eagle looked a little unwillingly at the arrogant flying beasts charging towards them. Then, it flapped its wings and changed direction. This way, they would have to detour around a valley. Although it was a little far, they wouldn't have to face the wild beasts chasing after them. It would take them less time to get there. Right now, Huali was in a hurry. She didn't have the time to care about anything else. The eagle flew very fast, and it looked like it was used to this kind of environment. It didn't take long for them to shake off their pursuers. Just as the eagle was about to show off, an alarm suddenly went off in its head and it cried out in a certain direction. Huali quickly took out a couple of parts from her holster, assembled them together and fired a shot in that direction. The bullet scattered as it flew. Bang bang bang, the bullet was blocked by something. A figure flashed through the air, and Huali fired several shots in quick succession. Although she couldn't match the enemy's speed, she was used to this kind of situation. She fired calmly and didn't let the enemy get close. Suddenly, the enemy sped up and fired at Huali. But Huali was prepared for this. She changed the gun's gear and pulled the trigger. A huge electric net appeared in the air, blocking the incoming bullets and the figure that was flying over. In order to avoid the lightning net, the enemy had no choice but to change direction and rest on the mountain wall. Now, Huali finally saw the enemy's face. It was a person. To be precise, it was a foreign race. He had wings on his back and could fly. He wasn't wearing shoes, but his toes were nailed to the mountain wall like an eagle's talons to keep him stable. His eyes were a dark gold, and his exposed skin was covered in dark brown lines. The person just stood on the mountain wall and didn't attack again. Huali stayed on the eagle's back and raised her gun, ready to fire the second the person made a strange move. The flying snowflakes almost filled the space between the duo. A normal person would have lost sight of the other a long time ago, but both of them had been on high alert. The eagle didn't stop, and the person on the mountain wall continued to face Huali. He only relaxed when Huali was out of sight. "Hey, Orville, what's going on?" someone at the foot of the mountain asked. "There's a woman riding a giant eagle. Do you know which side she's from?" "I don't know. She's heading that way." "That way?" "Never mind, let's go back first. The hail is finally over, so let's get something to eat. The captain said he has urgent orders." "All right." Orville flapped his wings and retracted his talon-like toes. Then, he flew down the mountain. Sillin and the others didn't know about this. Right now, they were watching Neo argue with the person standing outside the safe zone. "No, I'm already full. If you come any further, we'll be overpopulated, and it'll put pressure on our environment. It'll also complicate the relationships between members of society, and..." Neo didn't finish his sentence because the screen showed Huali pointing a cannon barrel at the door behind the tree. "Barbarian." Neo finally pressed the button unwillingly after analyzing all the possible scenarios. After Huali came in, the eagle behind her flew to the cliff and found a place to rest. Neo's expression improved a little when he saw the eagle's self-awareness. He was going to flip out if the big guy squeezed in as well. Bird poop was too disgusting. If the eagle knew what was going through Neo's head right now, it would have torn him apart with its claws. "Why are you here?" Neo asked Huali in annoyance. "I can't take care of those things alone." "Do you really think I can?" "You have equipment here." Huali looked at Neo's lab. Neo ran to the lab's entrance and spread his arms. "I'm telling you, I'll fight you to the death if you try to touch my lab. You'll have to step over my dead body if you want to go in." Huali shot Neo an expressionless glance before turning to Ah Shou. "Did you fall?" Ah Shou nodded with pursed lips and red eyes. Fuck." Huali put down the box on her back and sat down on the sofa. She didn't pay any attention to Sillin and the others at all. Sillin and the others didn't speak to Huali either. Maybe it was because Huali had dissected too many things, or maybe it was because of her cold personality, but they always felt that Huali's eyes were cold. She looked at everything like it was a corpse, and she looked like she was going to start dissecting with a scalpel in the next moment. Huali was sitting relatively close to Huimao, so the sleeping Huimao's nose twitched a little. He opened his eyes and shot Huali a glance. Puzzled, he got up, walked around Huali and sniffed at her. Huali didn't react to the cat's actions. She shot it a glance, but it was obvious that Huimao was immune to Huali's cold gaze. Or rather, he was a little thick-skinned and didn't take it to heart at all. "I smell bird feathers," Huimao said. She came here on a giant eagle, Silan answered. Not that, it's another smell. It's more like the smell of a foreign human. Silan and the others looked at Huali at the same time when they heard Huimao's words. Huali slowly put down her cup and said, I'm not a foreign human, but I ran into a foreign human who can fly on my way here. When Huali had reconstructed Orville's face on the light screen, Erdi cursed in a low voice, fuck, why is it him? Gu Xan rubbed his chin. He had some impression of this person, but he hadn't come into direct contact with him. It looked like Black Viper's men weren't simple at all. Orville's background was even darker than Erdi's. Chapter 280. Since Huali had left her safe zone to seek help, then the RB-13S that had been released into the safe zone would definitely be able to destroy the sturdy materials outside. Not long after Huali arrived, many large boxes fell from the sky above the planet. They were all made of special materials, and there was a password lock on the outside. The parachutes on top of the boxes opened when they fell from the sky. In the forest, a few beasts that were hunting for food saw the box that fell from the sky and were very curious. After the box fell, these beasts slowly approached it. They walked around the box and sniffed, but didn't smell anything. The box was sealed so tightly that not even the slightest scent leaked out. Moreover, the outside of the box had been cleaned, so the beasts didn't sense anything out of the ordinary. Bang! The sudden noise from the box startled the nearby beasts and caused them to retreat a little. A while later, the beasts curiously approached the box again. Bang! There was another noise, but this time it was even louder. It sounded like something was bumping against something inside the box. The box moved a little. Bang! 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 The noise grew more and more rapid. The beasts had gotten used to it by now, so they didn't retreat as far as they would the first time. Instead, they continued to wander around 3 meters away from the box. Beep! The password lock on the outside of the box rang, and the box was unlocked. The box opened with a click. Its fur, the same color as the snow, was exposed. It looked very harmless. This was the RB-13 that Neo had mentioned. It looked like a white mouse, except that it was a little bigger. With a height of 1 meter, it was much smaller than the beasts around it. The white mouse looked around with its ruby eyes. It didn't seem to feel cold despite the low temperature. After sniffing a little, its gaze stopped on the moving beasts. The beasts were no longer afraid when they saw that the white mouse was the only thing that came out of the box. Instead, they treated it like food, opened their mouths and bared their sharp teeth at the white mouse like a tiger watching its prey. When one of the beasts pounced on the white mouse, the others hurriedly followed suit, afraid that they wouldn't get their turn if they fell behind. Mournful cries rang out in the forest. Then, there were the faint sounds of chewing and flesh being torn apart. A while later, all that was left was an empty box and some flesh that was slowly being covered by the snow. The password lock on the box lit up, and the parachute straps on the box broke. The box gradually shrank, and its opening closed. It lay there quietly, buried by the snow. Inside Neo's safe zone, everyone was watching a video in the living room. It was a hidden camera that Neo had placed in a corner of the forest earlier. Since some bioweapons and beasts would sense it when the video was transmitted, he hadn't turned it on until now. But Neo didn't care about that now. Moreover, there weren't many bioweapons or beasts in this weather, so the chances of being discovered were very low. The video showed a primary bio-soldier fighting with a dire beast, which attracted a white mouse. Although both the dire beast and the bio-soldier were injured, they were still full of fighting spirit. When they saw the newcomer, both sides looked at each other but didn't pay too much attention to it. However, dire beasts didn't like a stranger sneaking up on them while they were fighting. So, the dire beast closest to the white mouse let out a threatening roar. Before it could finish its roar, a white shadow flashed and the dire beast's neck was bitten off. After tossing the dead bioweapons to the side, the white mouse looked at the bioweapons. The bioweapons didn't know what fear was, and neither did they know how to run. Instead, they charged at the white mouse. Brown blood splattered across the snowy ground. The bioweapons were instantly dismembered. A white mouse against a white background, but the combination of colors was enough to make one's hair stand on end. So fast! Gu Xan exclaimed. And its claws are very sharp. Erdi looked at the white figure walking further and further away in the video. He then looked at the patch of brown flesh on the snow that looked like it had been cut by a knife. In just a split second, the white mouse had been able to tear a bio-soldier into such a state. Not only was it fast, its claws were sharp enough to cut through bone without hesitation. Huali didn't say anything. She simply touched her long box. They still have room to grow. Neo added, if every white mouse we send over is like this one, then they're only at the beginning of their growth. Their appetite is huge, their metabolism is fast, and they can grow a lot every day. What? Those things still have room to grow. Does that mean they'll grow even stronger? Erdi asked. That's for sure. Since they're biochemical beasts and were originally experimental subjects, their stability is very low, and their mutation rate is very high. They might be mutating and dissimilating at every moment, so the growth of each experimental subject doesn't have a fixed direction. Maybe one of them is an armor type that focuses on defense, and the other one is an aggressive type. Who knows, that's why I said that RB-13 is a failure. Neo still looked down on the RB-13 even though it was a great threat. From an experimenter's point of view, RB-13 was a failure in Neo's eyes. Is that so? I wonder if you'll turn into its feces in a few days, Erdi said mockingly. Do you think I'm an idiot? Why would I provoke those failures? You're the ones who should be leaving. Neo wasn't worried about his life at all. Huali wiped the spear in her hand. Idiot. Neo was about to retaliate when Silen pulled him back. Will the tricolored bean's toxin work? Neo's attention was attracted by Silen's words. I don't know about that. We can give it a try, but we'll have to change the gun first. If we're still using the same gun, we won't even be able to break RB-13's skin. Silen nodded and walked to where Neo kept his weapons. It didn't take long before Silen walked out. Neo, can I borrow a few spare parts from your lab? No. Neo rushed into the lab and raised an arm. If you want to touch my stuff, you'll have to cross my dead body first. Erdi, Gu Xian, and Huali all looked at Neo. Gu Xian spun the gun in his hand, Erdi played with a small knife, and Huali raised the sniper rifle she had just assembled. Neo. After a minute of stalemate, Neo twisted his neck and said, I'd rather die than submit. This is my place, and I'm already being merciful by letting you in. If you're alone, you'll die sooner or later if you run into those things. You know that the safe zone can't stop them at all. Even if you have an isolation pod, do you really think you can survive 10 days inside one with your weak constitution? Huali attacked him mercilessly. Neo fell silent. It would be terrible if he had to rely on nutrient fluids to survive. His constitution was very resistant to nutrient fluids, and he had always believed that hibernation would affect his intelligence. That was why he had always rejected both methods. Huali's words were like a sword to Neo's chest. Huali didn't like to be passive, so she immediately chose to find a partner the moment she learned that RB-13 was going to be released into the planet. It would be very difficult for her if she was alone. She couldn't stay on the eagle's back all day, and most of the time, the most dangerous creatures weren't the beasts, but the humans. Huali knew that a lot of strangers had come to this area before she came here. They were probably the reserve newbies the organization had mentioned last time. Sho wasn't the only safe zone that had been taken over. Huali knew that there were 3 of them, but she didn't know if they were taken over through threats or cooperation. Huali didn't know that there were outsiders in Neo's place. She simply thought that Neo's place was a good location, and there were a lot of experimental equipment with great potential. Many people in the organization knew that Neo had high requirements for his experiments, and a lot of the high-end equipment could be used as weapons. That was why Huali had come here. But Huali was even more relieved after she saw Silen and the others. 3 helpers would be a bit more of a guarantee. Neo's face scrunched up like a steamed bun. After a moment of hesitation, he said, "Then, you can only use a few of them. You must tell me every equipment you need. Otherwise, they won't be activated without my orders." "Of course." After Silen walked into Neo's lab, he stopped in front of a test bench in a familiar manner. There were a couple of instruments on the bench, and after Neo had inputted his orders, Silen deftly dismantled some of the parts on the instruments. Neo was screaming at the side because he was afraid that Silen would destroy them. Both Gu Xian and Erdi were surprised to see that Silen had dismantled a couple of Neo's precision equipment with a palm compound knife. They didn't know that this guy was capable of this. Gu Xian and Erdi didn't know anything about Silen. In fact, they hadn't even heard of Silen before. If Gu Xian was still in the army, he would have been able to learn a lot from Silen, but he wasn't in the army right now. As for Erdi, he had heard of anyone with a bit of fame in the underworld such as Orville. However, he had never heard of Silen before. Silen used some of the parts he had dismantled from Neo's instruments to assemble a couple of simple devices. These devices would allow Silen to modify the guns in the warehouse. Complicated modifications were out of the question, but simple modifications were definitely doable. An hour later, Silen tossed a gun to Gu Xian and Erdi. He looked at Huali and tossed her a gun as well. Huali caught it. The bullets were modified as well. Neo had synthesized a lot of poison earlier, so it was enough. "Let's try it out first. If the poison doesn't work, we'll look for other ways immediately," Silen said after distributing the bullets. It wasn't a good idea to sit around and wait for death. Silen preferred a prepared fight, and he needed to know his enemy better than anyone else. It was still snowing outside, and the temperature was very low. Silen and the others put on a thin protective suit and a breathing mask before exiting Neo's safe zone. The protective suit was white and could insulate them from body heat. This way, the wild beasts wouldn't be able to detect them due to the heat. However, their movements were slightly restricted after putting on the protective suit. They wouldn't be as agile as usual. Although Neo said that he wasn't interested in a failed experiment like the RB-13, he was still very concerned about the poison's effect on the RB-13. After Silen and the others left, Neo entered the data processing room in the lab. There were a lot of RB-13s, and they were scattered all over the place when they landed. There were 3 RB-13s in Silen's area alone, and the one they were tailing was the one Neo's surveillance camera had captured. It was also the closest RB-13 to the safe zone. When the white dot appeared in their vision, Silen and the others held their breaths in unison. The white rat had just finished off a wild beast and was chewing on its meat. According to the original plan, Huali and Erdi were responsible for providing cover while Silen and Gu Xian were responsible for shooting the white rat with the poison. Therefore, Huali and Erdi weren't armed with poisoned guns, but bullets with higher penetrative power. Since there were trees in the way, Silen and Gu Xian were able to sneak closer to the white rat. Behind Silen, Erdi's eyes flashed when he saw the young man sneaking in without a sound. In terms of stealth ability alone, Silen wasn't as good as Gu Xian. In fact, he was even better than the latter, but they didn't know him at all. That being said, it was strange that Silen trusted him so much. One shouldn't leave one's back to another so easily. What Erdi didn't know was that if he pointed his gun at Silen, the yawning Huimao next to him would probably bite him to death. Silen didn't completely trust Erdi and Huali. That was why he told Huimao to stay next to them so that he could attack them immediately if they made a move. Silen made a hand signal to Gu Xian after he reached the predetermined position. It was a common gesture used in the military, so Gu Xian naturally understood Silen's meaning and responded with a "I'm ready" gesture. The duo aimed their guns at the white mouse. Silen was aiming at the white mouse's ears, and Gu Xian was aiming at the white mouse's eyes. But the moment they fired, the white mouse sensed them and swiftly moved its body, causing the last 2 bullets to hit its torso. However, since both the bullets and the gun had been strengthened, they were able to break the skin a little, and the drugs should be able to seep in. Scylla immediately left the place he was hiding after firing the gun. He didn't even look at where he had hit the white rat. In the next moment, the white rat with 2 wounds on its body scuttled towards Scylla. Scylla didn't stop running. Sensing the movement behind him, Scylla dodged the white mouse's swinging claws and flipped over to kick the white mouse's neck. A white mouse's neck was very fragile, but that was only true for a normal white mouse. RB13 was undoubtedly a lot stronger than RB13. Scylla's kick was strong enough to break a tree as thick as a person, but the big white mouse only stumbled a few meters to the side after taking the kick. Gu Xian, Huali, and Erdi all fired at the white rat while it was slowed down by Scylla's kick. A couple of red spots had appeared on the white rat's body. They were the marks left behind by the bullets. However, the white rat was still as ferocious as ever. It ignored the people shooting from behind and chased after Scylla. Did the poison not work? Chapter 281. Scylla dodged a few of the white mouse's attacks with his agility, and the trees around Scylla were cut down like tofu. The red dot on the white mouse's body was slowly shrinking, and it wouldn't be long before it completely healed. This was something no one had expected. After all, the bullet contained a toxin that could swiftly kill a biochemical soldier. What do we do? Erdi asked Gu Xian while searching for an opening to fire. Gu Xian didn't know how to deal with this kind of biochemical beast either. Their muscles were very strong. When they were highly constricted, they could block external physical attacks. When a bullet hit them, it would be stuck before it could penetrate deep into their muscles. This kind of big white rat had amazing recovery ability. When the bullet exploded, the explosive force blasted a hole on its body, but it didn't take long for it to gradually recover. Gu Xian felt that they still hadn't found the right target. The noise attracted the attention of some wild beasts that were out hunting for food. Not only did Scylla and the others have to deal with the white mouse, but they also had to deal with the incoming wild beasts. Bang! Erdi's bullet blew up the head of a beast that was rushing towards him. However, Erdi didn't show much excitement. On the contrary, he was very worried. The same bomb could easily blow up a beast, but it wouldn't work on a white mouse. Setting aside the white mouse's dodging ability, the effect wouldn't be as obvious as it was on a wild beast. Scylla circled around the area and found an opportunity to kick the white mouse from time to time, slowing it down and giving the other 3 an opening to shoot at it. It was only during this opening that the trio's shots would be much more accurate. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to hit the intended spot. The white mouse's ear was blown up, but it wasn't slowed down at all. However, it was obvious that the white mouse was a lot more irritable than before. Scylla and the others' attacks had aroused its killing intent. Its fur stood up like steel needles, and it looked like it was growing longer and longer. Gu Xian and Huali had hit its claws, but it only wavered a little when they were hit. Then, it continued to chase after Scylla as if nothing had happened. Scylla really couldn't understand why the white mouse was so fixated on him. It hadn't given up even after chasing him for half a day. However, Scylla noticed that the big white mouse's ears were pressed down tightly when it ran. Ever since Scylla and the others opened fire, it had not pricked up its ears. Bang! It was unknown who shot the big white mouse's paw, but the big white mouse's pursuit slowed down slightly. Scylla took this opportunity to fire 3 shots in a row. The bullet bypassed a branch and hit the white mouse's ear. With 3 consecutive explosions, the white mouse's left ear was blown off, and a strange reddish-brown blood stain almost covered the entire left side of the white mouse's face. Squeak! A sharp scream assaulted everyone's eardrums like an ultrasonic wave. The murderous aura of this large white mouse grew even thicker, and the steel needle-like fur on its body doubled in size. Thick scales began to appear on its limbs, all the way to its toes. If this continued, hitting its toes would be useless. Just as the white mouse screamed and began to change, Silen fired 3 more times in succession. The 3 bullets drilled into the areas that had yet to be covered by the needle-like fur. Bang! 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 Reddish-brown blood splattered everywhere, and the white mouse's entire head was only left with a blurry skull and some flesh. They didn't care if the white mouse was dead or not. After Silen opened fire, the other 3 also opened fire at the same spot. All 4 of them fired at the white mouse's ears, and they didn't use poison bullets. Instead, they used explosives. As the banging sounds faded away, the white rat's head was gone. Its body, which had expanded to twice its original size, was still standing there, but it was no longer moving. Dead? Gu Xian and the others cautiously approached the white mice. Just as the 3 of them approached, Silen suddenly shouted, "Be careful." Since most of their attention was placed on the white mouse, and because the white mouse let out that cry, the surrounding dire beasts hurriedly avoided it, the 3 of them paid less attention to their surroundings. After Silen spoke, Gu Xian and the other 2 became wary of their surroundings. Huali didn't have Silen's reaction speed, but she still reflexively pulled her spear lower. She had just turned her head when a long white whip swept towards her. Unsurprisingly, Huali was sent flying. If she hadn't blocked the divine spear with her spear, she would have been paralyzed by now. The spear that blocked the attack had a dent in it. Huali could easily smash rocks with this spear, but she didn't think that it would be dented by the attack. The white whip was the white mouse's tail. It wasn't the one they had shot in the head, but another one that had come from another part of the area. Right now, Huali's hand was numb from holding the spear, and she couldn't lift it at all. Her back had been scratched by the white mouse's tail, but Huali should be thankful that she wasn't dead or dismembered like the biological soldier. Erdi's situation was slightly worse than Huali's. Although his reflexes were stronger than Huali's, he stumbled just as he was about to dodge. Unable to dodge in time, he could only watch as the claw came crashing down. Squeak, the white mouse screamed again. Erdi crashed to the ground with a bloody gash extending from his chest to his abdomen. If the wound was just a little deeper, his stomach would have been split open. The white mouse on the other hand had lost a large piece of flesh from its back, and a reddish-brown strip had suddenly appeared on its originally white body. This was the white mouse that had let out an angry scream just now. Not far away from the white mouse, Huemao's mouth was still sticky with reddish-brown blood. He licked his lips and looked at the white mouse in front of him. Unfortunately, its flesh was harder than he had imagined, and he had only managed to tear off a small piece of flesh. While the white mouse paused because of Huimao, Silen and Gu Xian fired at the white mouse in rapid succession. One of them aimed at the white mouse's eyes, and the other at its slightly open ears. A couple of pops later, the white mouse's head exploded just like the first one. This time, however, they had wounded 2 people. The mouse's claws are poisoned. They need first aid. Gu Xian said after inspecting Erdi and Huali's wounds. He looked around and saw that Gu Xian was carrying Erdi, and Silen was carrying Huali. Then, they hurriedly ran towards Neo. Snowflakes were still falling from the sky, and Silen kept looking at the front as he ran. Gradually, Silen's attention was drawn to the snowflakes. Most of them were accumulated snowflakes, but there were also individual snowflakes among them. In Silen's vision, the snowflakes seemed to fall at a speed that was hundreds or thousands of times slower. The perfect hexagonal shape was so familiar. Neo had learned of the situation through the surveillance system while he was hiding inside the safe zone. That was why he had prepared medicine in advance. Silen and Gu Xian brought the 2 people who had been scratched by the white mouse back to the safe zone and placed them in a medical room. Erdi was still relatively clear-headed. He could feel the burning pain of his wounds, but Huali's consciousness was already fading. Although Erdi's wound was a lot bigger than Huali's, it was obvious that Erdi's resistance was better than Huali's due to his constitution. Erdi's wound was brownish-red, and there was inflammation around it. In comparison, the wound on Huali's back was a lot scarier. The wound wasn't big at the beginning, but it festered very quickly. The reddish-brown color had spread to almost half of her back. Since Silen and the others were all men, they called Ah Shou over. At first, Silen and the others thought that Ah Shou would cry a little and burp a couple more times. But to their surprise, Shou's hands were steady and practiced even though his eyes were red. Silen asked Neo in private for the reason, and Neo answered in a matter-of-fact manner, "Since I've decided to come to this place, it's only natural that I know basic defensive techniques and how to treat wounds. If I don't even know this, then I might as well kill myself." His words sounded reasonable, but they were surprising when they were applied to Ah Shou. However, he was only surprised for a short while. Silen still had important matters to attend to. The reason why Huimao didn't make a move in the beginning was because Silen had asked it to collect information on the white mice. The information obtained would allow Silen to better understand this biochemical beast. Although these white mice were very tough, Silen was relieved that they were not like the bio-soldiers that did not have a fixed weakness. In other words, once the white mouse's head was blown off, it would be dead, and its body would not continue to move. After calculating the white mouse's defense, Silen realized that all the bullets he had were not enough to penetrate the white mouse. Excluding the accuracy of the shots, it would take 3 bombs to completely blow up a white mouse's head. The poison bullets did not have much of an effect. It would be better if the explosives were faster and more powerful. Unfortunately, the materials he had were limited. He didn't have an endless supply of bullets, but he didn't know how many white mice there were. Silen wasn't stupid enough to fight the white mice with his bare hands. He could deal with them with a long sword, but that was only limited to one-on-one battles. Silen wasn't stupid enough to fight them with his bare hands when faced with a large number of white mice. He still had to think of a way to get the bullets out, or modify his gun once more. Silen called Neo over to discuss his ideas. Neo's face scrunched up like a steamed bun again. "Based on the materials we have now, the power of the explosion can be increased, but the bullets will be bigger and slower. Based on the data you provided, the white mice have a 73% chance of evading. If that's the case, we might as well use the original explosives." Silen thinks for a moment before asking, "Don't you have other materials to make more powerful explosives?" "I don't have any other materials that you can use to make more explosives." After all, his research doesn't require them. However, there is a place where he might have other materials. Neo walked into his lab and keyed in a password. A cupboard device opened up, and Neo keyed in a string of characters. Then, he pressed a metal block on his bracelet that looked similar to Ah Shou's. As the metal block flashed, the characters on the device quickly changed. 5 minutes later, Neo frowned and said, "This is ridiculous." "What is it?" "That guy actually compromised with the invaders." Neo was very disdainful. It would appear that the place Neo mentioned was occupied by the same people as Silen's group. The only difference was that the occupation was a little more intense. "We can't get the materials." "We can't. That guy is being watched." "How far away is the place you mentioned?" Silen pulled out a map and had Neo point it out. Neo took a look and pointed at a certain place. "This is it." Silen estimated that it would take him at least half a day to get there. While Silen and Neo were discussing the materials for the explosives, Gu Xian came over and called for him. "Silen, come here for a moment. I have something to tell you." Erdi and Huali should be thankful that Neo had a lot of antidotes. Erdi was starting to recover after the treatment, and Huali wasn't as resilient as Erdi, but she had woken up as well. "They look like they're recovering pretty well," Silen said after inspecting their injuries. Erdi was leaning against the back of his chair with a dark look on his face. "I'm very understanding. I know that people who were scratched by rats have emotions." Neo was expressing his concern and forgiving Erdi and Huali's sullen faces, but he didn't realize that his words sounded like mockery to everyone else. Erdi narrowed his eyes and suppressed the anger he felt because of Neo's words. He said slowly, "I was tricked." Neo motioned for him to speak more clearly, but he was looking at Erdi with obvious suspicion. Didn't have the time to argue with Neo right now. The calmer his voice was, the more angry he was. I could have avoided that claw attack, but someone shot at my leg. Rolled up his pant leg. There weren't any visible marks on his leg, but upon closer inspection, there was a tiny needle mark. Neo used a testing device to confirm that Ertie's leg had indeed been shot with a plant anesthetic. Neo had researched this plant anesthetic before, but he didn't think it was useful in the end, so he didn't delve too deeply into it. The plant was from that forest, and it was relatively common compared to the tricolored beans. Silen did notice that someone was nearby at the time, but he didn't look for Ertie and Huali because of their injuries. The person had followed them for a while, but Silen had asked Huimao to lure some wild beasts to stop the person. Gu Xian didn't know about this. Ah, I got it! Neo suddenly shouted. The chain in his hand flashed, and when he pressed it, a still image of 3 people appeared on the screen. That's the person who was following us. Huimao pointed a claw at a person with 4 eyes. Hey Do sent this to me when they weren't paying attention. If you're going to find the materials, you'll have to come into contact with these people, Neo said. Hey Do's place was taken too. Ah Shou asked sympathetically. It looked like she wasn't the only unlucky one. Hey Do has the materials you need to improve your ammunition. You'll need to hurry if you want to get them. Hey Do said that they're planning to do the same, but judging from their intelligence, I think there's a 93% chance that they've wasted the materials. If you go now, you'll be able to get between 75% to 33% of the materials, Neo said. Ertie rolled his eyes at him. Why do you have to be accurate to 2 decimal places every time? There's no need to explain to someone with your level of intelligence. Neo turned around and continued to talk to Silen. Other than the chemicals Silen was looking for, there were also a few things that Hey Do had kept away from him for a long time. That's why you should take them back while you're at it. Neo passed a temporary list to Silen. Silen glanced at it briefly before replying, I'll bring them to you when I have the time. I'm sure you have the time. Where are you going? I'll go with you. I'm not injured right now anyway, Gu Xian said. Silen probably wouldn't be able to get the materials by himself. It's fine. Wheeze and I will be fine. You stay here in case someone tries to take this place, Silen turned him down. Gu Xian was about to say something when he heard that Huimao and Silen were going together. Ertie and Huali couldn't see it because of the angle, but he saw it with his own eyes. If it wasn't for Huimao dragging the white mouse back with his teeth, Ertie would have been torn to pieces by the white mouse's claws a long time ago. Wait. Huali said, why don't you let Mercury take you there? Mercury? Silen was puzzled. It's that stupid eagle. Neo explained. You can save a lot of time if you let that stupid eagle take you there. That's perfect. Silen was pretty curious about the silver eagle. That being said, Mercury was a really strange name. Huali explained Mercury's situation and some techniques to Silen. Then, she walked to the tree with Ah Shou's help and put a finger to her mouth. A whistle sounded, and a silver-white figure appeared in front of them not long after. Huali gave Mercury a few instructions so that it could familiarize itself with Silen and Silen's whistle. Mercury couldn't speak, but it understood what they meant. After crying out twice to indicate that it understood, it lowered its body and allowed Silen to jump onto its back. Before Silen could move his feet, Huimao jumped onto Mercury's back and walked a circle on its back. At first, Mercury wasn't used to it. It shook its head and flapped its wings, and gradually calmed down. After Silen jumped onto the eagle's back, Huali rubbed Mercury's lowered head and told it to be careful. Mercury let out a cry before flapping its wings and flying off. Huali and Ah Shou watched Mercury fly away before returning to the tree. It was his first time riding a giant eagle, so Huimao was very excited. The fierce wind and flying snowflakes didn't dampen Huimao's enthusiasm at all. Out of habit, Huimao started rubbing against Mercury's feathers. Mercury's feathers stood on end, and it lost its balance and swayed in a circle. It almost threw Silen off. In the end, Silen had to knock Huimao a little to calm it down. Mercury finally calmed down again. Huimao's tail was still wagging restlessly even though Silen was holding him down. One look and Silen knew what Huimao was thinking. Flicking Huimao's ear, Silen said, "What are you thinking now?" Huimao scolded back and grinned, "Silen, do you think I'll grow a pair of wings in the future?" "No, maybe I'll grow multiple pairs of wings." "Maybe, but you don't have wings right now, and you need Mercury's help. Don't bully it." Silen pinched Huimao's ear and said, "Got it." Huimao flicked his ear. Although that was what he said, he couldn't get rid of the pair of wings in his heart. If he had wings, he could fly, and if he could fly, he could catch birds. It had to be said that a glutton's thoughts always went in the direction of eating. Mercury clearly knew Heido's location very well without Silen's guidance. It led Silen straight to their destination. The snow had grown heavier, and everything was white from top to bottom. At the beginning, there were still predators hunting for food, but there were very few of them now. Silen even saw 2 white mice. The white mice's snowy background made them very difficult to spot, but Silen could easily distinguish them from the snowy white background. The 2 white mice were still some distance away from Neo's safety zone, so he didn't have to worry about them for now. 10 days had passed. 20 days left. 20 days. At first, Silen thought that Black Viper's people were trying to select a group of seedlings from this survival test and recruit them into Black Viper to replace some of the older members. But now, Silen thought that he had learned even more than that. Not only were there people who were brought here to be tested like him, there were also people who were born and raised in Black Viper. These people were ordinary, but they were also extraordinary. They might not be as strong as Silen, Gu Xian, and Erdi, but they all had their own strengths and specialties. It was hard to understand their way of thinking sometimes, but he had to admit that they were all talented people. Why on earth did they put these people together with the people who were brought here to be tested? Both Guan Feng and Gu Chang'an had told him not to treat Black Viper with the same attitude. What did the real Black Viper look like? It was like the snow in the sky, and it was hard to tell. After flying for a period of time, Silen gradually approached the destination. Mercury looked to the side and signaled to Silen that their destination was there. Then, it made a turn and landed at a more secluded place. "I know the route. Find a place to hide and I'll call you when the time comes." Silen jumped off Eagle's back and said to Mercury. Mercury nodded and shot a glance at Huimao who was staring at its wings with great interest. Then, it ran away like it was running away from something. Silen poked Huimao and said, "Come on, let's get to work." Heido was located around the mouth of a volcano. Qinlai didn't know if the volcano was dormant or active, but it hadn't erupted in the past 100 years. There were a lot of plants growing around it. Evergreen plants made up a large portion of the planet. Even though it was covered in snow, one could still see bits of green from the side. Huimao began scanning the terrain and the structure of the safe zone below. He quickly came to a conclusion and found the entrance. Of course, Silen and Huimao weren't going to enter through the main entrance. Instead, they were going to enter through a small vent. The 3 people who occupied this place definitely didn't know much about this place. After all, their time here was limited. Silen and Huimao came to a secluded vent. It was blocked by a few layers of mesh windows. Huimao cut off the wires connecting the windows to the inside of the safe zone. Silen took out his tools and quickly removed the window. A man and a cat entered through the narrow vent. After passing through the narrow space at first, Silen finally arrived at a room in the safe zone. Before Silen came in, he already knew what this place was based on the structure that Huimao had scanned. It was a spare room where the instruments were stored. Heido was locked in the laboratory next to it. Silen and Huimao split up. At that moment, Heido, who had dark skin and a chubby face, was squatting in the laboratory. Not far away from her was a fierce-looking man who was playing with a small knife. Not far away, two people were discussing something. The man suddenly put away the knife and sat down next to Hei-Do. He looked at the cowering Hei-Do and said with a smile, "Your reinforcements should be here soon, right?" Hei-Do trembled. Hei-Do wasn't the only one who was surprised. Sillin was also surprised. This man knew that Hei-Do had contacted Neo. When the fierce-looking man smiled, Hei-Do didn't relax at all. Instead, she felt even more scared. There was a type of person who looked more chilling when they were smiling than when they weren't smiling. Sensing Hei-Do's fear, the man raised a hand and rubbed Hei-Do's head. "Don't be afraid, little girl. I'll keep it a secret for you." Sillin. Hei-Do is a girl. No, that's not the point. The point is that there's something wrong with this man. These three aren't from the same group. Sillin decided to observe for a while longer. They hadn't started using the materials Sillin was looking for yet. Moreover, Celine also wanted to see what this burly man was planning. "Let's make a deal," the man lowered his voice and said to Hei-Do. The other two couldn't hear him at all. Hei-Do raised her head and looked at the man with puzzlement in her eyes. At first, the other two were prepared to kill her, but this person persuaded the other two to let her live for the time being. The man smiled helplessly. Although his smile looked disgusting, Hei-Do relaxed quite a bit. "If your classmate comes to save you, I can help you kill those two. But I hope you can do me a favor." Hei-Do thought for a moment and looked at the man. If he could explain, she would agree. The man let out a sigh of relief. He continued, "It's like this. I need a place to rest. After we take care of those two, you and your classmate can just give me a place to rest. I'll freeze to death if I go out." It sounded simple enough. Hei-Do nodded without any pressure. The man grinned widely, revealing his pearly white teeth. Hei-Do couldn't help but shiver. The other two didn't know what the burly man said, but Celine, who was hiding in the dark, heard it clearly. Sillin told Huimao that if the man really did what he said, then he would let it go. But if he didn't take care of the other two, then Sillin didn't mind Huimao killing him. Inside the other room, the four-eyed man who had trailed Sillin's group and ambushed Erdi was talking to his companion. The topic of conversation was none other than Sillin's group. Celine looked at the two people who were talking to each other, and his hand moved. Bang! Bang! One of them fell to the ground. Although the man had sensed it and retreated the moment Sillin opened fire, and his reaction time was pretty good, the man didn't expect that the bullet would still penetrate his temple. Although the interval between Sillin's two shots was short, it still gave the other man enough time to dodge. Just as the four-eyed man jumped, a knife stabbed him and nailed him to the wall. Chapter 282. The four-eyed man didn't close his eyes even before he died. His eyes were filled with astonishment and resentment because he didn't think that the person who mercilessly stabbed him in the back was his accomplice. Even though he had wanted to kill his accomplice since a long time ago, he didn't think that his accomplice would harbor the same intentions. The attack was too fast. There were no unnecessary movements, no hesitation, no killing intent, and no killing intent at all. Then, it sliced through the four-eyed man's windpipe, severed his neck, and nailed him to the wall. If this place was built with the same materials as Neos, then it would be very difficult to leave a mark on the walls. However, this brawny man's blade had pierced through the four-eyed monster's neck and left a hole in the wall. It was obvious how special his blade was. The blade wasn't big, and its earthy gray blade didn't reflect any light. However, it looked ordinary from afar. Sillin had seen the brawny man play with this blade before. The brawny man skillfully turned the blade over and over in his hands. It looked like he had been playing with it for many years. Some people would withdraw their killing intent after killing too many people. They were like old hunters hiding in the dark, silently delivering a fatal blow to their prey. Judging from this, Silen knew that this fiendish-looking brawny man had taken more than 1,000 lives, unless this was his nature. It took him less than 5 seconds to finish off these two people. In a fight between experts, life was short. After the four-eyed man was dead, the brawny man walked over and pulled out the blade. Blood dripped down the tip of the blade until there was no trace of blood left on it. Silen stared at the brawny man cautiously. Although he wasn't aiming his gun at the brawny man, he was ready to fire the second the brawny man made a move. When the brawny man saw Silen's reaction, he folded the blade and raised his hands to show that he meant no harm. "You're the helper the kid called over?" the brawny man asked. Silen didn't answer. Instead, he yelled at the room behind the brawny man, "Hey Do, come out and contact Neo." Hey Do shrank into a corner when she heard the commotion outside, but her eyes lit up when she heard Silen's words. She stood up and walked out. The big man standing at the door moved aside to let Hey Do pass. Hey Do carefully looked at the big man, then at Silen, and walked step by step towards Silen. Silen tossed a list to Hey Do, who was walking over. It was Neo's list. "Here are the things Neo is looking for." Hey Do relaxed when she saw the familiar words on the list. She moved the metal bracelet around her wrist and sent a message to Neo. Then, she went into the laboratory to prepare the medicine. Only Silen, the burly man, and the two corpses were left outside. Hui Mao jumped onto the two corpses and began to search for tools. After searching for a long time, he did not find anything useful. There were only 2 modified guns and a knife that he had picked up somewhere. "These 2 guns belong to that little girl, not them," the big man said. "What about yours?" Silen looked at the big man and did not see any guns on him. "No." The big man made a helpless gesture. "Those 2 didn't trust me, so they didn't let me touch the guns. We're not together. We met them in the forest and helped them take care of some wild beasts. They said they found a safe place and asked me to come with them. That's why we came here. Oh, and if I hadn't stopped them, that little girl would have died a long time ago." The big man sat down on the ground after saying this, completely ignoring Silen's vigilance. He kept the knife in his hand. Silen looked at the big man quietly and asked, "Who are you?" The big man smiled mockingly when he heard Silen's question. "Just a prisoner." "Why did you come to this place?" "I don't know. I woke up in this strange place. If I didn't have a knife in my hand, I would have been eaten by the wild beasts in the forest and turned into a pile of shit a long time ago." The big man sat cross-legged on the ground with one hand on his leg and the other supporting his chin. He looked a little dispirited. Inside the lab, Hey Do's mood improved a lot when she learned that the young man who saved her was called Silen. "Silen, I'll go with you in a bit. I've prepared everything you asked for, and there are some spare supplies in the lab. Take them with you when you leave," Hey Do said happily. "You're going too?" Silen looked a little troubled. Was the eagle really strong enough to carry the load? 2 people, a cat, and all those resources. It was going to be a difficult task. "Yeah, I'm bringing the lab with me," Hey Do said while packing. "Lab?" "Yes, my lab is a little special. It can actually be considered an independent body and can fly." Silen was surprised. Huimao's scan didn't reveal anything special about the lab. He didn't expect it to be so special. "Can I go with you?" The big man looked at Silen, and then at Hey Do. "You promised me that this place won't be safe after your lab leaves." Hey Do's lab was the core of this safety zone. Once the lab left, the safety zone's defenses would plummet. Hey Do nodded. Suddenly, she thought of something and looked at Silen. "Can we take him with us?" Silen didn't agree immediately. They needed help right now, and this man didn't look like a heinous criminal. However, there were too many things to consider under these special circumstances. If something went wrong inside, the safety zone would collapse. Silen pulled Hey Do over and said a few words to her. Hey Do nodded and ran back into the lab. A moment later, she came back out and said something to Silen. Silen looked curiously at the big man and signaled for He-do to go back to her work. They would leave immediately after she was done packing. Silen walked up to the big man. The big man waited for his reply. "Ba," Silen said. The big man narrowed his eyes. Then, he looked indifferent. "I didn't think someone would recognize me." "A friend knows you. He asked us to take you there. Nice working with you." The big man paused for a moment before chuckling. "Nice working with you." He-do's safety zone was half the size of Neo's. When Silen asked He-do why it was like this, He-do said that Neo had too many demands. When the safety zone was assigned, the guy immediately took it for himself and gave a bunch of excuses and data analysis. Now that he thought about it, it made sense. Given Neo's personality, he had always been a self-centered person. Words like humility and euphemism didn't even exist in his dictionary. He-do had guns, but they weren't like the ones the four-eyed man and the others had obtained earlier. Most of He-do's guns were locked in a secret storage cabinet in the lab, and the ones she had shown them were just some initial test products. He-do also gave Ba a gun. Silen didn't have any objections. Since Gu Exa entrusted this person, it meant that this person was related to the military. Although he didn't know what exactly happened, Ba was still a trustworthy person for the time being and a great help. Silen had always thought that the most dangerous thing in this place wasn't the biochemical beasts or the wild beasts, but the humans. The invasion would begin when the humans formed small groups. No one knew what would happen in the next 20 days, so Silen's goal was to gather all the forces in the surroundings before these small groups matured. After packing up, He-do set the security department's internal system to hibernate. All the access control windows were closed, and the place was completely sealed off. Silen whistled when he came out. Before Mercury appeared, 2 bioweapons hiding in a nearby cave heard the whistle and ran over. Silen raised his gun and fired twice. The gun Silen used was the poisonous kind. The tricolored bean's poison was useless against the white rats, but it was deadly against the bioweapons. Ba looked at Silen thoughtfully when he saw the 2 bioweapons fall to the ground. Mercury quickly came over. The poor guy was covered in snow and ice shards. He probably hadn't found a suitable place to hide, and the cold wind had almost turned him into an ice sculpture. The second it heard Silen's whistle, Mercury immediately flew over eagerly. Silen didn't ride on the eagle this time. Instead, he stayed in the flying lab with Ba, He-do, and the others. After the lab left the safe zone, it turned into an independent flying structure. It didn't have to endure the cold wind and snow. However, Huimao still chose to sit on the eagle's back. It looked more artistic when you had wings. While flying back to Neo's safe zone, Silen looked at the scans in He-do's flying lab. The white dots represented the white rats, the blue dots represented the wild beasts, and the brown dots represented the bioweapons. Right now, the blue and brown dots were mostly concentrated in a few places. Those places were probably sheltered from the wind and snow, but the white dots were more scattered. By the time they returned to Neo's safe zone, there were 17 white rats on the scans. Compared to when Silen went to He-do's lab, he saw more. It looked like the modification of the guns was imminent. He-do's lab merged into Neo's safe zone from the edge of the cliff and made some adjustments to the external facilities. Neo was very unhappy that his zone was partially modified. He blah 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 blah, from internal stability to harmonious development, from local factors to macroscopic adjustments, he made one logical argument after another. However, no one paid him any attention. Other than Ba, who was surprised to see such a weirdo for the first time, everyone else was numb to it and ignored Neo's protests. After He-do arrived, she busied herself with the merging of the lab and the safe zone. Now that she had obtained the materials Silen needed, she was starting to synthesize a new bomb. Erdi was very unwilling to accept the fact that the four-eyed man had been killed. If he wanted revenge, it would only be meaningful if he did it himself. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair. Gu Xian was the happiest about Tu Ba's arrival. Tu Ba was from the army and was once a high-ranking officer. However, some things happened and Tu Ba was imprisoned in the Empire's prison for life. 3 years. It's only 3 years, but it's enough to completely destroy a person. It's enough to erase all of that person's achievements. From being respected to being despised by others, it's only been 3 years. Tu Ba sighed after talking with Gu Xian. That's not your fault. The empire is too big. It's inevitable that there will be rotten parts, Gu Xian comforted. When I was in there, I used to wonder if my beliefs were wrong. I wondered if the oath we all obeyed back then was wrong, but I gradually stopped thinking about it. Why? Because there's no time for you to think about those things in prison. A moment of carelessness and you'll lose your life. Tu Ba pointed at his chest. When he was in prison, there were a few times where he had almost been pierced through. How did the imperial prison end up like that? Gu Xian exclaimed. The imperial prison? Ha! Tu Ba rubbed his forehead. There are many types of imperial prisons. Gu Xian didn't ask further when he saw that Tu Ba didn't want to explain. He patted Tu Ba's shoulder. It was rare to find someone who came from the same military background as him. Oh right, Gu Xian, I want to ask you something, Tu Ba said. What? Let me be clear. I don't know anything about this place. Just like you, I woke up here. Not that. What I want to ask is, what's the background of that Celine guy? Him. Gu Xian shrugged. I don't know either. There's no file on someone with that kind of ability in the military. I've never seen any files on him. Hui Mao rolled on the table. When it rolled over and saw Gu Xian's pigtail, its claws itched again. It raised its claws to play with it. Tu Ba found it interesting. He raised his finger and poked Hui Mao. Hui Mao scratched a few marks. Yo, you have a fast reaction. Not only was Tu Ba not angry, he was even more interested. Gu Xian nudged Tu Ba with his elbow. Don't provoke it. This little guy is very powerful. Tu Ba didn't give up. He only stopped after poking his face a few times and scratching a few marks. The materials provided by Heido were very good. They completely satisfied Silen's expectations. Although he could only make a limited number of bombs, it was enough to deal with the white mice. Silen had created 3 types of bombs, and the explosive power and penetrative power of the 3 types of bullets were different. They were suitable for killing white mice and biochemical beasts from different angles. Heido and Neo worked together to set up new defenses and made a batch of microsurveillance devices. They were scattered around the forest near the safe zone. Some scanners were set up at a distance as well. These surveillance devices and scanners were more discreet. The wild beasts wouldn't be able to detect them unless they were in close proximity. There's a white mouse 1,500 meters away. Are you guys going to take it out? Heido shouted at the people in the living room. Coincidentally, Silen had already made a batch of bombs and distributed them to everyone. Let's take out that mouse first. It's going to cause trouble for the safe zone if it gets close. Huali picked up the gun and bullets Silen had left on the table at the center. I'll take care of it this time. Erdi walked out of the room with his gun in hand. He wanted to vent some of his pent-up frustration now that his body had recovered. Erdi, Gu Xian, and Tu Ba are enough. Huali, you shouldn't go until you're fully recovered. The 3 of them are more than enough, Silen said. Huali frowned and was about to say something when Neo interrupted coldly, it's just a waste of bullets if I'm not fully recovered. Erdi ignored Huali and Neo's sarcasm and left the room first. Gu Xian gave him a reassuring gesture and followed Erdi up the elevator with Tu Ba. Silen dragged Neo, who was arguing with Huali, by the back of the collar and into the lab. Let's see how powerful the new bullets are and compile the latest data. When it came to data, Neo ignored Huali and turned on the device. Heido also came over to watch. Ah Shou and Huali stayed in the living room and watched the situation outside through the screen. On the screen, Erdi and the other two had quickly found a rendezvous point. The three of them were spread out in 3 different directions. It was a good place to work together. Once they trapped the white mouse in one place, the other two would be able to follow up and kill it no matter where it went. Bang! A bullet brushed past the white mouse's eye socket, penetrated its skin, and exploded there. The explosion destroyed the white mouse's entire eye. Before the white mouse could get angry, 2 bullets came from 2 different directions and hit the spot where the first bullet exploded. 2 explosions later, the white mouse's head was blown off. In reality, the second bullet was more than enough to blow off its head. The third bullet was just a safety precaution. Judging from the data, the first bullet was pretty destructive. The white mouse's brain nerves were damaged, and its movements paused for a moment. This made it easier for the second bullet to hit its target, Heido said excitedly. But if my guess is correct, Erdi's first shot was aimed at the white mouse's eye and missed, Neo criticized mercilessly. That's because the white mouse reacted too quickly and moved in that instant. There's no way the previous bullets would have blown off its entire eye. Silen recorded down the data the machine processed so that it could be used as a reference for the subsequent modification of the bullets. Sho was drinking fruit juice in the living room when she blinked and said, "The sky is going to clear up soon." Erdi happened to hear Sho's words and asked, "How long until it clears up?" 2 days. When the sky clears up, those things will come out again. Erdi twirled the gun in his hand. This time, he wasn't afraid of those things anymore. He had a weapon and a helper, so what was there to be afraid of? Silen told everyone to rest well for the next 2 days after hearing the news because they might not have much time to rest. What would happen after the sky clears up? According to Sho, the temperature would rise rapidly. After the snow melted, parts of the land would turn into puddles and swamps. Would there be even more strange things at that time? Silen couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. No matter what, they had to be fully prepared. Be it the white mouse, the bioweapon, the alien Huali met, or anyone else who hadn't shown themselves yet, there was bound to be a conflict that needed to be resolved in a violent way. Heido and Neo's new defense system was more than half complete. Sometimes, Silen would go out and disguise the surveillance cameras outside the branch. Erdi and the others weren't people who could sit around and do nothing. Even when they had enough sleep, they wore protective gear and went into the forest to hunt some wild beasts for practice. When the last snowflake had fallen, the sky slowly cleared up. The hailstorm and snowstorm had come and gone as quickly as it came. The melting snow had flooded some of the low-lying areas. And in those places, round heads popped out of the water one after another, running towards higher ground. Chapter 283. Now that the sky had cleared up, some of the animals that had been hiding for the past few days started to show themselves. The forest was much livelier than when Silen first arrived. And because of this activity, they could often hear some roars and whines through the surveillance devices in the forest. The angle of predator and prey was always changing. In the past, the ferocious beasts could be considered as one of the overlords here, but after the arrival of the white rat biochemical beast, they could only become the prey. Silen and his group had cleared out most of the white mice that had been hiding in the forest during the snowstorm, but a few more white mice and bioweapons came to the forest after the sky cleared up. After all, the forest was a good source of food for them. Gu Xian, Tu Ba, and Erdi had just gone to the forest to kill 3 white mice, a couple of bioweapons, and 2 wild beasts as food for the day. Every time someone came back from the forest, they had to go through a disinfection process. Neo's obsession with cleanliness wasn't without reason. There were too many germs out there, and no one knew how many new germs would appear after the snowstorm. After all, many germs mutated too frequently, and everyone had to be on guard. Silen and Neo worked together to create a couple of compound antibody serums in the lab. Everyone was given a shot to prevent infection, especially people like Sho and Heido. If they were seriously infected, it would be very difficult for them to survive. Their constitution made them vulnerable in this area. Hui Mao counted the days with his claws every day to see how many more days he had to stay here. How was it today? Silen asked the trio who had just returned from the outside. Gu Xen, Tu Ba, and Tu Ba walked into the newly set up disinfection room. The disinfection room recorded the germs they carried before they were disinfected, and if there were any new germs, they would take some samples for Silen and Neo to update their virus database and create a special antibody serum to prevent further infection. It's alright, we're used to dealing with white mice now, so it's easy to kill them. But the number of black bugs has been increasing lately, Gu Xin said while wiping his face. A lot of black bugs had appeared after the sky cleared up. Their heads were flat and had no eyes, only sensory cells that looked like eyes. They didn't have a single clawed foot. Their walking style was similar to that of a snake, and they were very fast. Although these black insects were only as long as a palm, they had fine, sharp teeth. At first glance, they looked like the spines of a feline's tongue. With these special sharp teeth, they could scrape meat from other animals for food. Most importantly, there were a lot of them. If he encountered these guys, Silen would choose to use the cryogenic cold beam gun because they were resistant to heat and cold. Of course, if he saw a bunch of black worms, throwing a Molotov cocktail at them was also a good idea. Even if they could withstand heat, they wouldn't be able to withstand fire. These guys usually like to hide underground. I bet the melted snow has flooded some of the low-lying areas, forcing the bugs out, Erdi said. He had killed many of these black bugs today. In short, just don't get bitten by them. Although these guys are small, one bite from them will leave a bloody hole on your body. Tu Ba had tested the bite force of these black bugs today. They bit through wood like a saw. One bite and the wood would turn into powder. It would be terrible if they bit a human. Silen's focus wasn't on the bugs. He had a feeling that their appearance meant something. He looked at Ah Shou. The little girl was holding a cup of freshly squeezed fruit juice and didn't react at all. Did that mean there was no natural disaster? Hui Mao, who was rolling around on the table in boredom, twitched his ears. He didn't seem too sure. He jumped down and walked around. He looked at Silen and said, "It's going to be an earthquake." Ah Shou, who was drinking fruit juice, choked and coughed. She looked confused. "I don't feel anything. Why would there be an earthquake? It's not natural." "It's man-made," Hui Mao said with certainty. He had already sensed the movements of the machines underground. Silen called Hui Mao over and showed him the map of the surrounding area. "Roughly where will it be?" Silen moved the map screen in front of Hui Mao. The others also gathered around curiously. Neo was still skeptical. Once Hui Mao pointed out Hui Mao's location, he would analyze it to see if he was telling the truth. Hui Mao raised his paw and pointed at a few points on the screen. Fortunately, Neo's safe zone wasn't close to the epicenter of these earthquakes. It was at the edge of the zone. Although he could feel the tremors, they wouldn't be as strong. Neo let out a sigh of relief when he finished his calculations. If this cat is telling the truth, this place won't be damaged. The materials used to build the safe zone should be able to withstand the tremors. But isn't that Mon's place? Heido pointed at a place close to the epicenter. Mond? That psycho. I don't know him. Neo hurriedly distanced himself from Mond. It was as if knowing Mond would lower his intelligence. Neo and Mond had always referred to each other as, that psycho. Silen and the others shot Neo an odd glance at the same time. Up until now, Neo had been publicly recognized as the most psychotic person in the world. However, they were curious about the person who could make even Neo call him a psycho. Mond is a person who understands animal language. He can understand animal cries, facial expressions, and body language, Huali explained. No, that's not it. Neo corrected Huali, that psycho doesn't understand animal language at all. It's just a dirty trick. You know, he used to flunk his language classes a lot. It's an undeniable fact that he's always failed his language classes. Huali ignored Neo's explanation and briefly explained Mon to Silen and the others. She was just done when the metal chain on Heido's wrist flashed. Heido pressed it without hesitation, and a young boy with a broom appeared on the screen. Heido, my dear. Who's behind you? Why is that psycho Neo with you? Mon said with a look of disdain. Neo pushed Heido's face away and smiled proudly. He shook his finger and said, 2 mistakes. 1, I'm not with Heido, Heido is with me. 2, the word psycho has always been with you. It's inseparable. On the screen, the corner of Mon's eyes twitched. He looked at Heido, who was pushed to the side, and said, Heido, my dear, tell this psycho to leave. Big brother wants to talk to you alone. It's urgent. Heido looked at the others and apologized. Then, she covered the screen and ran back to her lab. Did Mon discover that his place is near the epicenter? Huali asked with a frown. Impossible, how could he know? Neo would never believe that Mon had that kind of intelligence. But Heido came out soon and told them that Mon knew that there would be an earthquake at his place. He originally wanted to hide at Heido's place, but Heido had moved to Neo's place already. However, Mon only knew Heido, so he wouldn't beg Neo for help even if he was beaten to death. How did that broomhead know that there would be an earthquake at his place? Gu Xan asked. Silen pointed at a black insect specimen on a shelf in Neo's lab and said, probably through that. After all, a creature that hides underground all year round is more sensitive to changes underground. Can that broomhead really understand the black insect's language? Erty rubbed his chin. He couldn't figure it out. That's just a conjecture based on a statistical analysis and a clandestine method, that's all. Neo insisted on his point of view. No one paid attention to Neo's words. Silen had other thoughts in mind. If there is an earthquake, this place won't be damaged because it's at the epicenter. But other creatures, at least the ones that live around here, will definitely run here. That's true. Tu Ba agreed with Silen's words. We'll probably be very busy then. While Silen and the others were discussing the problems they would face, Heido's bracelet lit up again. I'm leaving for a moment. Heido ran back to her lab in embarrassment. It didn't take long for Heido to come out. The bracelet's communicator wasn't turned off, and Mond was standing there with a constipated look on his face. Knowing that Mond was too embarrassed to say it, Heido said timidly, Mond and the others want to come over here, I won't allow it. Neo refused without hesitation. The veins on Mond's forehead bulged, but he didn't explode. Instead, he looked at Heido. Heido looked at Silen because she didn't have the heart to do it. She trusted Silen the most out of all of them, and she felt that Silen could solve this problem. He was also the only person who could reason with Neo's uncanny knowledge, so Neo would definitely listen to him. Mond clearly noticed Heido's gaze, but he couldn't see anyone else because of the angle of the screen. However, it was obvious that Heido wasn't looking at the crazy Neo. Us? Silen caught onto the word and asked. Mond has 3 people with him. They're about the same as you guys, Heido explained. Don't worry, they're good people. They even saved my life before. Mond hurriedly said because he was afraid that Silen would refuse. No one was willing to accept a stranger in this kind of environment. Although he couldn't see Silen's face, anyone who could speak at a time like this definitely had some decision-making power. Oh, no, there's a burden other than that psycho. Neo yelled. The faces of the 3 people standing not far away from Mond twitched in unison when they heard Neo's words. Burden? You're the burden, all of you are. Also, that's not how you use the word, is it? That crazy Neo's place is big enough to accommodate all of us. We can help you solve some of your problems. Mond ignored Neo's objection and continued. That won't do. Who knows if you'll become invaders? Are you questioning my character? character? Do you even have that? Scylla patted Neo's shoulder and pointed at the lab when he saw that Neo and Mond were arguing again. Your molecular diagram is complete. Neo was no longer in the mood to argue with Mond when the molecular diagram was mentioned. He hurriedly ran to the lab. It was a lot quieter without Neo around. Let's continue our conversation. There are 4 people on your side, including you. I want to see the other 3, Scylla said. Heido had already adjusted the angle of the screen so that it was facing Scylla. Gu Xian and the others weren't in his field of vision. Scylla raised an eyebrow when the other 3 people appeared. One of them was the Orville that Gu Xian and Erdi had mentioned before. Wait a moment. Scylla left to discuss with Hua Li and the others. He wanted to confirm if Orville was trustworthy or not. Orville? Tu Ba twirled the blade in his hand. That kid may not be a good person, but I believe he knows when to advance and retreat. He knows what he should and shouldn't do. Scylla looked at Gu Xian and Erdi. Both of them nodded in agreement with Tu Ba. It was true that Orville wasn't a good person. In fact, he was notorious in some circles, but he wasn't someone without principles either. Scylla then asked Hua Li for her opinion. After all, Orville was like a ticking time bomb if they didn't get along well with each other. To his surprise, Hua Li didn't object. Both sides weren't injured at the time, and the past was in the past. When Scylla saw Mond's expectant face on the light screen again, Scylla allowed both sides to meet each other. Other than Scylla, everyone else seemed to have different levels of understanding towards each other. After receiving a guarantee from the other side, Scylla went to find Neo and finally managed to convince him to let the 4 of them join him. In fact, Neo just wanted to see Mond's submissive face. It would be a great way to vent his anger. Neo didn't have the heart to think about anything else at all. Those people were far less attractive to him than the experiment he was currently working on. As for how Mond and the others were going to come over, Scylla and the others didn't need to worry about it. All they needed to do was send someone to meet them after they arrived. Right now, Scylla and Heido were busy inspecting the safety zone and reinforcing some of the defenses. Everyone was busy with their own things, and no one noticed Huimao lying on the table. Huimao's eyes were closed like it was asleep, and its tail wasn't moving at all. If the cat had any nefarious thoughts, it would have wagged its tail a couple of times. Huimao's ears were twitching at a frequency that was hard to discern. Scylla glanced at it when he passed by the living room, but didn't disturb it. The cat had probably discovered it. Soon, the forest started to grow restless. The animals in the forest seemed to be quarreling, and some of the animals from other areas had come over to cause a ruckus. They're here. Heido said while looking at the dots on the screen. Needless to say, Gu Xian, Erdi, and Tu Ba grabbed their guns and walked out. The 3 of them were bored out of their minds, and they couldn't help even when they saw how busy Scylla and Heido were. Neo, on the other hand, wasn't involved at all. They weren't of much use other than hunting wild beasts and rats. The 3 of them felt extremely uncomfortable. It was as if they had suddenly become superfluous. Was this the feeling of being a burden that Neo was talking about? Hua Li stayed inside the safety zone with great self-awareness. She had realized the gap between her and the others, and her constitution was as fragile as an eggshell compared to Gu Xian and the others. However, Hua Li wasn't dispirited by the difference in constitution. Everyone had their own strengths. What surprised Hua Li the most was Scylla. Up until now, Scylla and Neo had been updating the virus database, creating antibodies and antidotes for a couple of plant and animal toxins, modifying his own guns and ammunition, working with Heido to reinforce the safety zone's defenses, and creating hidden surveillance devices with limited materials. In terms of individual combat strength, Scylla wasn't any weaker than Gu Xian and the others, and his constitution was even better. Up until now, Hua Li hadn't seen Scylla affected by germs or poisoned. What kind of person was Scylla? Even in Black Viper, a person like him was rare, not to mention that he wasn't a member of the organization. really want to dissect a person like him. It was rare that Hua Li's desire to dissect rose again. Silen, who was setting up defenses outside the safety zone, felt a chill run down his back and made him shiver. Gu Xian and the others had gone out to welcome Mon's group into the safety zone. One of them had been scratched by a flying beast, and his wound was starting to get infected. It looked like it wasn't just a scratch, but a secondary infection as well. Mond was fine except for his pale complexion. The other two had some minor injuries, but they weren't that serious. The fact that they were able to get here safely proved that they were capable. It probably wouldn't have been this easy if we'd left a little later. Mond gulped down a cup of water and said while panting. It was true that the beasts and other animals weren't this noisy when they left, but now it was like a boiling pot of boiling water. Most of their injuries had come during the second half of their journey, and the one who was scratched had only gotten hurt 20 minutes ago when they approached the area. Everyone had been disinfected after they came in, and to their surprise, the disinfection room had provided them with 6 new types of pathogenic bacteria. They were all from Mond and Orville. When they learned this, they couldn't help but sigh. No wonder their wounds had worsened so quickly. When Mond finally recovered, he saw Hui Mao lying on the table and his interest was piqued again. It was his habit to interact with animals and read their thoughts. The gray cat grew impatient after being poked by Mond's fingers. It swiped at the back of Mond's hand, and 3 bloody claw marks appeared on the back of Mond's hand despite the hard work it took to get this far without drawing any blood. Looking at Hui Mao's impatient eyes, Mond swallowed and accepted the restoration spray Ah Shou passed to him. He sprayed the claw marks and obediently stopped provoking Hui Mao. It only took a single glance for Mond to understand the emotions and meaning behind Hui Mao's eyes. If Mond poked him again, he wouldn't just be scratching his hand with his fingers. Boom, the tremor began. Through the image displayed on the screen, everyone could see the situation outside. The ground near the epicenter had also cracked. Although it was not a naturally occurring earthquake, if they had not known beforehand that it was man-made, no one would have thought that way. Many animals were already running toward them, especially the black bugs. They didn't see any white rats or beasts, so they probably had to wait a little longer. Silen took out a box and distributed the guns and ammunition he'd made earlier to the group. Among them were the ultra-low temperature beam guns and a few thousand-degree incendiary bombs. Chapter 284. The panic brought about by the earthquake caused the animals in the forest to scurry away from the epicenter. Some obediently climbed over the cliff and didn't linger on it for too long, but the curious and bloodthirsty wild beasts noticed the abnormality on the other side of the cliff when they climbed over the cliff and moved closer to Neo's safe zone. This kind of wild beast would undoubtedly be hunted down by Gu Xian and the others who were guarding the perimeter. The chaotic environment also covered up Gu Xian and the others' tracks. Some of the beasts didn't attract too much attention even after they were killed. Perhaps the earthquake was the biggest threat to them right now, not the assassins hiding in the shadows. The modified gun could use improved explosives to kill the white mice, a different kind of bullet to kill the beasts, and poison bullets to kill the bio-soldiers. There were also other modes that could be switched between. It was a simple multi-purpose gun. Although it couldn't compare to the guns they had used before, it was still impressive that they could modify a gun to this extent with the limited resources they had. This was why Gu Xian and the others admired Silen. In the eyes of Gu Xian and the others, Silen was an enigma. He seemed to be able to talk to anyone, and he was even able to delve deeper into the topic of anatomy with Hua Li. Could he be someone from the RAS? That was what everyone suspected. After all, other than Black Viper, everyone would think of the Royal Academy of Sciences as soon as they could find someone who was more accomplished in various academic fields. Erdi had asked Silen about this before, but Silen didn't give him a direct answer. He didn't say yes or no. Since they had made sufficient preparations before the earthquake, they were able to face the white mice and other dire beasts calmly. When they were tired, they would go back to the safe zone to rest and take a breather, and then someone else would take over. The frightened beasts were more violent than usual, and the place was a mess. Gu Xin and the others were much stronger than the people outside because they were able to save ammo and hit their vitals in one shot. There were also some climbing and flying beasts roaming around the cliff walls from below, especially the climbing beasts and insects. They had escaped from the forest and attacked fiercely, but there weren't many of them. Mercury was guarding the cliff wall and cleaning up the insects that had climbed up. Ah Shou and Huali would clear out some of the more troublesome beasts through the windows on the cliff. Mercury's large claws were nailed to the cliff wall, and its wings were flapping furiously as it swatted away a large number of small bugs. Sometimes, the hidden bugs were more of a threat to the safety zone than the big vicious beasts. When it flapped its wings, Mercury would also use its sharp beak to peck at those that were not swatted down. Bang! Mercury was startled by the movement beside him. He turned his head to look, and all the hair on his body stood on end. Ga? On the cliff not far from Mercury, Orville changed his form. The sharp claws on the soles of his feet were nailed to the cliff like Mercury. The wings on its back trembled, and feathers shot out like bullets towards the larger insect beasts. It was a given that Mercury didn't have a good impression of Orville. After all, their first meeting hadn't been a good one, but they were working together right now, and Huali had told Mercury about it before. That was why Mercury had to endure it no matter how uncomfortable it felt. There was no way it would admit that it was jealous that Orville's feathers could be used as bullets. Heido and Neo were constantly paying attention to the feedback from the defense network around the safety zone. They would contact the others to take out the invaders if anything went wrong. Where was Silan? Silan didn't go with them. He didn't shoot the wild beasts, nor did he pay attention to the defense network with Heido and the others. Instead, he went underground with Huimao. He had to admit that Huimao's tunneling skills had improved a lot. Practice made perfect, and the more holes he dug, the better he became. Somewhere on the planet, close to the place Guanfeng had brought them to when they first arrived, there was a building that wasn't very tall. Most of the people inside the building were robots, and to be more precise, they were equipped with advanced robots that looked no different from humans outside of the planet. The few humans in the building were all people who had a say in Black Viper, including Guanfeng and Gu Chang'an who had come with Chiu Su. They were all gathered in a spacious, round meeting room on the third floor. There was a light screen at the center of the room, and it was displaying the image of a spinning planet. It was the planet they were currently on. There were a lot of red and blue dots on the planet, and each dot represented a person. The red dots represented people like Silan, who were not Black Viper people, and the blue dots represented natives of the Black Viper race. On the first day, the red and blue light dots spread out and spread out. Then, they gradually gathered in groups of 2s and 3s, mixed with red and blue, and then huddled together. There were also some light dots that changed in between. For example, the red light dots that represented the 2 people killed by Silan and Tu Ba would turn black after their deaths. The leader of the group sighed when he saw the dots slowly gathering on the screen. It's only been half the time, and this is already happening. There were 3 spots on the spinning planet where most of the dots were gathered. One of them was where Silan was. The other 2 spots were spread out in different parts of the planet. They were quite far from each other, and they all had different geographical environments and climates. Silan's spot was mostly made up of rocks and forests, while the other 2 spots were mostly made up of desert and plains. Every spot had a different way of fighting, and the reason people gathered here was different as well. In comparison, Silan's spot was the mildest way of gathering people, and it was also Guanfeng's favorite. Guanfeng was very satisfied with Silan's performance, and he was thinking that he could just exempt Silan from AF1's exam and let him pass the exam internally. Someone who could make Neo give up his spot for you definitely has the ability to take over your position. The man looked at Guanfeng meaningfully. Of course. Who taught him that? That said, the people you recommended aren't bad either, Ah Lang. Guanfeng crossed his legs and swung back and forth on his chair. It looked like the 2 people he recommended had succeeded. The man Guanfeng called Ah Lang was one of the 3 leaders of Black Viper, Christian Lang. Gu Chang'an let out a low chuckle. There may be a lot of people who can compete for the other two, but not everyone can replace Silen. That guy's brain is like a robot's, and his computing power is unparalleled. Shikai, maybe Silen can help you complete your origin plan, Christian Lang said. The man who was leaning on the table at the outer row heard Christian Lang's words and slowly raised his head to look at the spinning ball and the dots of light at the center of the meeting room. He asked suspiciously, "Is that so?" "Maybe." Guan Feng suddenly thought of something and turned to look at Shikai. "Kid, do you think all the robots you put underground will be wiped out?" Shikai frowned. "Is that possible?" "They're all advanced robots, the latest upgrades. They may not have an origin AI, but their attack power can't be underestimated. Let's watch." Christian Lang touched the screen with his finger and displayed another image filled with dots of light. Shikai stared at the image on the screen. "Actually, I'm more curious about why he went underground. Is it just because he knows that there's something underground that can cause earthquakes? Is it because he wants to stop the earthquakes?" No one knew the answer to this question, and they were all curious. It was exactly because there were so many things they didn't understand that they paid a lot more attention to Silen than the other two places. On the other side, Silen followed Hui Mao underground. The deeper they went, the more Silen could sense the mechanical activity. The thing that caused the earthquakes was deeper, but Silen had arrived at an underground tunnel several hundred meters below the surface. Not even Neo or Heido's scanning devices could detect this place. Although it felt like they were in the wild when they were on the surface, the deeper they went, the more he could sense the presence of machinery. There were traces of machinery in many places, both in the tunnel and elsewhere. Silen and Hui Mao entered a tunnel. Hui Mao scanned the tunnel and obtained an underground structure that looked like a spiderweb. After memorizing Hui Mao's scan results, Silen and Cat walked toward the center of the spiderweb. The spiderweb always stayed there quietly, like a silent hunter waiting for the arrival of its prey. Silen didn't think of himself as prey, but there were many things waiting for him inside the spiderweb. For example, the robots near the center. These robots had completely surrounded the core area. Therefore, if Silen wished to approach the core area, he would have to break through this layer of robot wall. Go! Silen unsheathed his long sword and charged toward the robot. A green light flashed in Hui Mao's eyes before he also charged excitedly. These robots had automatically activated their attack mode the moment Silen and Hui Mao appeared. They were very fast, and their movements weren't stiff at all. The robots' arms and legs were equipped with sawtooth blades, but they didn't use any explosive weapons. Perhaps out of consideration for this underground network, explosive weapons were more destructive to this place, so the creator didn't equip them with such weapons. Even if they didn't have any weapons or high-energy laser guns, their combat power was still very high. Silen's figure flashed through the air. Every slash of his blade cut a robot in half. The headless robots could still move. Even after their heads were destroyed, their bodies could still react with a delay. These robots weren't the ones Silen was looking for. Moreover, Silen knew that these robots weren't autonomous at all. Compared to the robots he had encountered earlier, these robots were pretty good weapons, but they were no different from swords and guns. They were all dead weapons. He kicked a robot's head into the wall of the tunnel, directly turning the robot's entire head into a round pancake. The knife in his hand was not idle either. After the tip of the knife stabbed the robot, a vibration frequency that was difficult for the human eye to capture actually created a dent in the place where the tip of the knife touched. Hui Mao also killed a robot with a single swipe of his claw. He had no qualms dealing with these kinds of robots at all. Moreover, the blades on the robot's arms wouldn't hurt him at all. At most, they would leave a mark that would disappear very quickly. 300 or so robots attacked one after another. Silen and Hui Mao were grinding these meat into pieces like a meat grinder. The people in the meeting room outside watched the rapidly decreasing signal on the screen. Guan Feng glanced at the tense Shikai and smiled without saying a word. Anyone who knew Guan Feng knew that the more pleased the old fox was, the more he liked to smile without saying a word. It was infuriating just to look at him. 300 robots. In less than half an hour, all the signal dots had disappeared. If they were human, then this meant that they were all dead. Guan Feng shook his feet and tapped his fingers rhythmically on the armrest of his chair. The rhythm of his fingers looked like the beat of a song. He would have started humming a little tune a long time ago if he wasn't restricted by the situation. In this place, Guan Feng didn't have the scholarly and gentlemanly air of a senior scholar at all. Underground. After Silen and Huimao had taken care of the robots guarding the place, they continued to walk toward the core of the spider web. They didn't run into any other robots along the way, but there was a robot at the very center of the place. This robot looked the same as the robots Silen had taken care of earlier, but its facial expression was completely different. It even had eyes. A person's inner thoughts could be reflected through their glasses. This was a kind of emotional expression, and this robot had the ability to think independently, just like the robots Silen had encountered before. If one took a closer look, they would notice that this robot was a bit more conscious than the robots Silen had encountered before. Every look it gave off the illusion that it was alive. This feeling was very familiar to both Silen and Huimao. It was so familiar that it made them excited. This robot was the main reason why Silen and Huimao had gone to such great lengths to find it. As for the cause of the earthquake, that was just a side effect. Neither Silen nor Huimao attacked the robot, and the robot didn't attack Silen either. Instead, it stared calmly at Silen and Huimao without anger or surprise. It looked like an old man who had gone through all the vicissitudes of life, and the only emotion left in him was indifference. Silen slowly walked toward it. There was a round table next to the robot, and this round table was the cause of the earthquake. There were some buttons on it that could adjust the epicenter and amplitude of the earthquake. The robot didn't react to Silen's approach. It seemed to know what Silen was going to do, so it moved out of the way and allowed Silen to touch the round table. After looking at the settings on the round table, Silen pressed a few buttons. After Silen pressed the buttons, the tremors gradually subsided. The animals who were panicking and running away from the tremors on the ground also gradually came to a stop. Has it stopped? Erdi asked Gu Xen. I think so. Let's wait and see. Alright. The cessation of the earthquake greatly reduced the pressure on Gu Xen and the others. Even if they were good at fighting, they wouldn't have an easy time against so many animals and insects. If it weren't for Silen's modified guns and ammunition, the white mice alone would have been enough to force them to retreat. Underground. After the earthquake had stopped, Silen looked at the robot that was standing quietly not far away from him. Still, that wasn't right. This robot didn't have the intelligence of Sigma. Even if it had more consciousness than the robots he had seen before, it was still inferior to Sigma. Even if this robot had a human-like appearance, even if it had facial expressions and eyes, it still couldn't compare to the intelligence of Sigma, who had the appearance of a primordial being. Why did it only change this much after 1,000 years? You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.